Welcome back everyone, I'm Olar. Today's video we got the Warp Change Primarch. Now before we get into the video, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and if you want to go a step further, don't forget to check out the merch in the link below. Don't forget to check out the merch in the description below. Now, let's get into the video.
The demon world had forgotten its human name long before the dream of unity died in fire. It hung in the eye like a tumor, its crust a scab of brass and blackened bone. Continents had been planed flat and rebuilt as scripture. Oceans bubbled, reduced to shallow seas of coagulated blood that steamed warp vapor into the bruise-colored sky. Cathedral spires of fused skeletons punched upward, each tower a chorus of silent screams locked in rictus beneath coats of dried gore and iron sigils. Upon the tallest of those towers stood the Dark Apostle. His armor was a shrine of dried viscera and hammered runes, crimson plates banded in black, parchment and flayed skin fluttering from every edge. Chain-bound books, bound in faces, hung at his waist and chest, their pages turning in an unfelt wind as they whispered sermons into the thin air. In one gauntleted fist he held his Crozius, a maul of blackened adamantium wrapped in crawling script that burned with ember light. In the other he cradled a vox stave, its head a snarling brass-clad skull wired into the tower beneath his boots. He looked down upon his congregation and smiled behind his helm. They spread across the plains below his cathedral in numbers that beggared counting. Herds of mortal flesh filled the valleys between the bone spires, regimented into squares and blocks and swaying columns that stretched to every horizon. Slaves dragged chains attached to icons wrought from welded ribs and shattered tank hulls. Cultists clad in patchwork armor and bloody robes knelt in the muck, foreheads pressed to the ground where scripture had been carved into the very stone. Corrupted regiments of former planetary defense forces stood in ranks, laser guns held to their chests, armor defaced with 8-pointed stars cut down to the meat. Billions, the apostle thought with satisfaction, billions of tongues to scream, billions of hearts to spill, a tithe worthy of Lorgar. Static hissed in his helm. He dipped his head a fraction. "Dark Apostle," came a vox voice, metallic and respectful from the tower beneath. "The final chains are in place. The flesh engines report readiness. The first waves await your word." The apostle's reply was a soft chuckle, a sound like broken glass. "Begin the litany," he said. "Prepare them for the knife." Beneath his perch, the tower shook as engines deep within its roots began to roar. Great pistons of bone and bronze drove downward, forcing titanic blades up through the plaza at the cathedral's base. The ground tore open in long gashes, stone and soil shearing aside as serrated obelisks rose, each coated in hooks and restraints. Chains rattled as slaves were hauled forward, shackled to the fresh-grown altars. Priests with augmetic limbs and rusted swords moved among them, painting 8-pointed stars on foreheads with a careful touch. On the plaza's edge, a squad of word-bearers watched the preparations. They stood apart from the mortal filth, giants in crimson and black, horned helms turned toward the crowd. Their armor bore the scars of 10,000 battles, bolter burns, chains-ward gouges, rusted dents from long-dead foes. Scrolls and chains clinked with every motion. One of them toyed with a string of severed hands. Another lazily scratched a rune of damnation into his shoulder pad with a combat knife. "Sermon day," one of them said, with the bored drawl of an experienced killer. "I hate sermon day. No one shoots back." The largest of them gave a dry laugh and turned his helm to the sky. He was a veteran champion of the war band, his armor draped in seals and trophies, a spiked halo rising from the backpack vents like the icon of a dark saint. His helm's grill had been filed into the suggestion of a sneer. "You lack appreciation for art, brother," he said. "Think of the scale. A fortress world of flesh given to the gods. Even the 8th Legion could not stage such a spectacle." "They would," Have done it in the dark, another word-bearer muttered. No banners, no sermons, just blades in the night. Coward's work. The champion's chuckle hardened. The 19th Legion were cowards, he said. Their Primarch most of all. Corvus Corax, the Shadow Prince, fled from Istvan like a whipped cur, ran to his holes and never emerged. The tales say he walked into the eye and lost himself. Perhaps he kneels in some corner, weeping over his dead. He spat a clot of blood onto the stone. They call it the Raven of Nevermore, another Marine said, whispered in the warp. A shadow that falls upon warbands and leaves only corpses. Hunters vanish. Demon worlds go silent. The Dark Apostles fear a ghost. The Dark Apostles fear many things, the champion said. They fear failure. They fear the displeasure of Lorgar. They fear losing their precious sermons. They fear anything that moves in the dark, that is not under their control. I fear nothing that bled on Istvan and ran. The raven is dead. Let ghosts hunt ghosts. One of them looked up at the bruised sky, where the sun burned as a dull reddish disk through a haze of warp smog. It is bright for the eye, he said. Too bright. The champion snorted. Enjoy the light while we have it, he said. Soon the sky will be full of smoke from the burning. Then you may pretend it is Nostramo, if you wish to honor cowards. He did not see how the sun began to change. The first to notice were the mortals, eyes lifted from the mud as the light dimmed. At first, it was the familiar sickening of a passing warp squall, a thickening of the air and a sour taste on the tongue. Shadows lengthened, colors dulled. Then the dimming did not stop. The crimson disk of the sun grew sallow, then ashen, as if ash were pouring across its surface. A murmur ran through the slave herds, a susurrus of confused prayers and terrified whimpers. On the tower, the Dark Apostles Crozius paused in mid-sweep. Augurs, he voxed. Report. What is occluding the star? Static answered him. Then a scrap of a panicked mortal voice cut off in a wet shriek. A second later, another channel opened, this one a tech adept shrilling Binharik that deteriorated into a stream of vox howls. Interference, the apostle growled. Warp decay over the primary lens arrays. Compensate. There was no compensation. The sun went out. One heartbeat the world lay under its hateful red glare, every bone tower and blood sea lit in bruise and rust. The next, there was nothing. No gradual twilight. No slow slide into night. The light simply ceased. An absolute blackness slammed down upon the world, crushing color and form, turning the billions into blind, gasping things. From the plaza came the first screams. In the trenches beyond the cathedral fields, a line regiment of mutant militia felt the world vanish. They had been standing to arms, laser guns clutched in clawed or twisted hands, backs pressed against foul sandbags made from flayed hides. They were not meant to fight an enemy today. They were here to look impressive, to snarl and bark, and remind the slaves that behind every sermon stood the promise of the gun. Their officers walked the parapets, swagger sticks tapping mutated shoulders, chains rattling as they cuffed anyone too slow to kneel when a priest passed. Then the darkness fell. One of the militia, a broad-shouldered brute with a horn jutting from his brow and a fused trio of fingers on each hand, yelped and squeezed his eyes shut, as if that would help. It made no difference. His world had shrunk to the stench of the trench and the sound of his own breath rasping in his throat. "Hold ranks!" shouted a voice up the line. "Hold your ranks, you wretches, or I will rip out your spines and feed them to the—" The voice cut off with a sound like meat being slapped onto a butcher's block. Something wet hit the mutant's face. He flinched, raised a hand, and felt warm, slippery matter smear across his cheek. The stench of copper and open bowels slammed into his nose. Around him, men began to shout, some firing their laser guns blindly into the black. The flashes of their shots lit nothing. The darkness swallowed the light whole. There was another sound, a low whisper, like silk sliding over stone, then a series of wet, neat noises, as though invisible blades were slicing through flesh. Bodies fell. The mutant saw them only in pieces, lit for a heartbeat by the muzzle flare of his own laser gun as he fired in panic. Officers who had been striding the trench parapets a moment before were coming apart in unnatural ways. One fell toward him in total silence, his torso sliding from his hips in a smooth, smoking cut. Another's head rotated a full circle on his neck before detaching, flipping once in the air and landing face up in the mud, eyes still blinking. Arms dropped without bodies, boots filled with feet. Stepped once more, then toppled. He saw brains. He should not have seen brains. The back of a sergeant's skull had been removed in a perfect circle, as if cut with a coring blade. Grey matter glistened in the dark, sliding free in a rope that slapped wetly onto the trench floor. Spinal cords shone like pale worms in the gun flashes, torn from shattered vertebrae. One officer collapsed beside him, his chest unzipping from throat to groin in an instant, ribs snapping open like a chest of drawers to spill lungs and heart into the mud. Something moved between the last flashes, something fast and impossible, cutting the night into sharper shadows. The mutant dropped his gun and tried to curl into a ball. Fingers scrabbled at his back, clawing for purchase, men climbing over him in their terror, trampling him into the filth. He heard a sound like 1,000 knife blades drawn across stone, and the trench line began to die. High above the trenches, the dark apostle watched the darkness move. He could see more than the mortals. His helm lenses cut through the shadow with powers stolen from demons and welded into glass. For long moments after the sun's death, though, even those lenses showed nothing but a void. No stars, no atmospheric glow, no aurora of warp fire. Then the black began to ripple. It was not a natural night. It was not the honest dark of a world without a moon. This was something alive. The apostle saw currents in it, eddies and flows, as if the void were a cloak draped across the firmament, and now someone was drawing their fingers through the fabric. Points of deeper darkness coalesced, gathering into drifts. At their edges, the apostle saw hints of movement, the slow, lazy beating of wings. Ravens, he thought. A flock. That makes no sense. The thought aborted as the first of them dove. They fell from the sky in a silent storm, not as individual birds, but as shards of absence. Each raven was a piece of night given a razor edge. They sliced through the air without sound, leaving contrails of frost and warp lightning. Where they struck, they did not rebound or shatter. They simply passed through matter, ignoring armor, bone, and stone alike, and the things they passed through came apart. The plaza below erupted in carnage. Slave chains snapped as the men at their ends were reduced to neat heaps of flesh cubes. One heartbeat they knelt, foreheads pressed to the scripture-carved flagstones. The next they were falling apart, carved into slices so clean that some remained standing for a moment, organs still twitching, before the geometry of their bodies failed. Blood fountained up, not in sprays, but in curtains, flat sheets of red that flapped from the impact of invisible wings. The dark apostle watched as an entire rank of corrupted soldiers simply ceased to be soldiers. Helmets and torsos separated from legs along effortless planes. Hands dropped from wrists. Every man in that line died in silence, the only sound the wet plap of meat meeting stone. "Ward circles!" the apostle roared into the vox, his voice crackling with sudden fury. "Demonic assault, vector unknown. Raise the shields. Seal the sanctum." He felt the warp stir at his command. Wards carved into the cathedral's bones flared, summoning sigils rising from the stone like columns of light. But the light was swallowed even as it formed. Ravens, shadow ravens, tore through it, each passing bird ripping away a piece of the ward, devouring the sigil like carrion. The protective field collapsed into sparks and smoke. Something was descending through the storm. At first it was only a deeper patch of black in the greater dark, a silhouette even shadow could not swallow. Then the ravens began to converge upon it, folding inward. Millions of winged fragments of void drew together, knitting like a wound closing, layering upon one another in whirling, screaming spirals. The air screamed. The stone bled. Warp lightning crawled across the tower, dancing from skull to skull. The shape took form. It landed upon the plaza, with a sound like a city dying. Stone shattered under taloned feet, slabs exploding and flipping into the air. The shockwave knocked mortals from their feet in a wide circle, tossed them like dolls, dashed them against the altars where their blood painted new scriptures across existing runes. The figure that rose from the crater was taller than a dreadnought, and narrower than any human thing had a right to be. Its entire form was a lattice of shadow blades and feathers made of void. Wings rose behind it, serrated and vast, every pinion an executioner's guillotine. Its limbs were long and lean, talons tapering to impossibly fine points. The only light on its body was its face, a pale, deathly mask of bone-white luminescence, featureless, save for the suggestion of eye sockets sunk too deep. Corvus Corax, the 19th missing father, had come home in the only way the eye allowed. Word-bearers opened fire out of reflex. Bolter salvos hammered the plaza, shells detonating around the shadow figure in flashing gouts of shrapnel and smoke. The explosions painted its form in stuttering glimpses, like a sequence of sketches. Here a canted head, here a sweep of a wing, here a taloned hand halfway through ripping a marine in half. The champion who had laughed at ghosts raised his own bolter and bellowed a curse. "By Lorgar's word," he snarled. "Come then, coward, face the sons of the true faith." He fired, every round a mass reactive curse, each shell inscribed with verses from the Book of Lorgar. The rounds struck the raven thing squarely. They vanished into its substance without impact, as if disappearing into ink. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the champion's world moved. The shadow Primarch was there, and then behind him, and then in front of him, with no time in between. Space did not seem to matter. One moment, Corax stood in the crater. The next, he was within arm's reach of the champion, without any intervening sense of crossing the distance. The champion tried to bring up his chainsword. Talons like scythes flashed once. For a frozen fragment of an instant, the champion remained whole. Then the front half of his body slid off the back half. Armor, flesh, bone, and spine parted with obscene ease. His upper torso hit the ground, hands still clutching bolter and sword. His lower body took a staggering step before folding. Both halves spewed entrails in opposite directions. His gene seed, two pale spheres nested in meat, flipped free in a gentle arc. Corax's hand moved in a blur and plucked them from the air. He held the hearts of his enemy between clawed fingers, as one might hold berries ripped from a bush. Black shadow fire licked around his hand. The stolen organs shriveled, withered, and fell as ash. The Dark Apostle watched his champion die and felt, for the first time in many lifetimes, something like fear. He tore his crozius from his belt and leapt from the balcony, dropping toward the plaza in a plume of warp fire. Demons bound into his armor shrieked, their voices adding warp sound to the world. He hit the stone with enough force to crack the plaza further, landing within striking distance of the raven thing. His crozius swung in an arc that had broken tanks and demon engines alike. The weapon hit Corax's side and sank in as if striking smoke. Runes flared. For an instant the world stuttered, reality trying to assert itself. The crozius screamed as its bound spirit felt something that was not demon, but not anything else it understood. The apostle roared a string of hexes, calling upon the names of dark patrons, demanding their power. "You are nothing more than another demon," he shouted, voice amplified by the vox stave. "A slave of the eye, wearing a dead Primarch's feathers. I command you in the name of the gods. Kneel, shade. Kneel or be unmade." The pale mask turned toward him. The eyes were not eyes. They were holes in the world that led somewhere much deeper and colder than the warp. For a moment, the apostle saw reflected in them a memory that was not his own. Black sand, roaring guns, the shattered hulks of loyalist tanks, the 19th Legion dying beneath treacherous guns on a world called Istvan. He saw Corax as he had been, armor white and black, face human, eyes full of a bitter, cutting grief. The image shattered. The mask loomed close, impossibly close, without having moved. The voice that came from it was not loud. It did not need to be. It spoke in a tone like a grave being dug. "Demon?" it asked softly. "No." The claws slid into the apostle's armor at the shoulder and hip, phasing through ceramite as if it were water. They met something deeper inside, something that was not quite flesh. Pain detonated up the apostle's spine. "I am recompense." Corax pulled. Armor split, flesh tore, bones snapped and screamed. The apostle felt himself come apart in sections, as if he were a puzzle being disassembled by an uncaring hand. One arm went one way, trailing chains and parchment. A leg went another, spinning end over end. His chest plate opened down the center, ribs cracking back, exposing his hearts and the furnace of corrupted organs beneath. He did not die quickly. Shadow tendrils, razor-thin, lashed out from the raven Primarch, catching the apostle's spilling viscera. Intestines were teased free, drawn out in loops that gleamed slick and red in the faint warp light returning to the plaza. Corax dragged them, coiling them around one of the risen altar spires, lashing what remained of the apostle's torso to his own sacrificial tower. The crozius fell from a severed hand, clattering on the stone. The apostle hung there, impaled on his own altar, lungs exposed and pumping, hearts pumping ragged spurts of blood across his partially flensed face. He tried to speak, but his jaw was no longer aligned with his skull. His tongue flopped, useless, in a mouth that did not know how to close. Corax stepped back and regarded his work with a cold clinician's gaze. "Preach," the Primarch murmured. Above the world, the war tried to flee. Traitor fleets that had circled the demon planet like carrion birds jolted into motion. Void shields flared as captains bellowed emergency orders. Engines screamed as ancient ships dragged themselves out of their lazy orbits. Firing arcs realigned. Torpedo tubes opened. Macro cannon decks rolled out on rattling servos. They never finished. The night went with them. Shadow torpedoes, not of steel or ceramite, punched out from the darkness that had swallowed the sun. They were not launched from recognized vessels. They seemed to simply appear beside hulls, cutting through armor like ghosts through walls. Where they passed, they left nothing but ruin. On a murder-class cruiser, the crew on the gun deck felt the temperature drop, breath fogged. The lumen strips popped one by one, plunging the long aisles of macro shells and feeding mechanisms into gloom. Then ravens were there, bursting from the walls and ceiling, carving men apart mid-shout. Limbs flew, blood globes spinning in the low gravity as atmosphere began to vent. In the command decks, Astartes and mortal officers alike were not merely killed, they were arranged. Whole crews hung from the vaulted ceilings of their ships, flayed and pinned in branching patterns that resembled raven wings when seen from the right angle. Blood pooled in spheres, drifting gently about the corpses, until shadow beaks speared each globe and drank them dry. Vox picked feeds caught glimpses of the scenes before failing, sending frozen images of crew turned into grisly iconography, rippling through the traitor fleet. Millions died in orbit in the span of moments, their screams never leaving their own throats as their ships vented them into the void, or left them as meat to decorate corridors. Back on the planet, Corax raised his head. He spread his wings. The world trembled. Astropaths far beyond the eye convulsed without knowing why. In chambers of psychoactive crystal and sanctified gold, Men who had never heard the name of Corvus Corax dropped to their knees, clawing at their own eyes as a word hammered into their souls with the weight of a Primarch's will. Nevermore. The sound had no direction. It was a pressure, a color, a taste. It burned lines into the warp that lesser minds could not survive. In listening posts maintained by the Raven Guard, the word repeated over and over, scarring cogitator banks. In hidden inquisitorial bastions, psi reactives shattered and charts curled in on themselves as the echo of a lost son of the Emperor stroked reality itself. On the demon world, the ground began to die. Corax walked to the center of the plaza, talons leaving no mark upon the stone. Around him, the remaining word-bearers, who had not, already been carved apart, fired and prayed and screamed and were unmade by the brush of his wings. He reached the altar at the plaza's heart, the place where the Dark Apostle had meant to offer up the first heart of the first sacrifice. He drove his taloned hands down. They punched through stone and soil and the world's outer crust as if through tissue. He sank them deep, deeper, until they found the pulsing, cancerous core. The daemon world's heart throbbed with stolen souls and bound warp entities, a knot of cruelty and devotion and horror. Corax's claws sank into it. He squeezed. The planet screamed. Across its blighted surface, fissures opened. Bone towers cracked from base to peak. Blood seas foamed and boiled away into steam. Cathedral spires toppled, raining down shards of iron and skulls. The billions upon billions of mortals who still lived for a few more heartbeats felt the ground lurch and swell beneath them. Some were swallowed as the earth split. Others were crushed under falling monuments. Some simply came apart as the shadow ravens descended in their final, endless storm. From orbit, if any loyal eyes had watched, it would have looked like a halo of shadow feathers expanding from the world's equator, a ring of moving black that shredded everything it touched. Flesh, armor, soul, and warp essence were all the same to those blades. They cut reality itself, and in their wake there was only emptiness. When the storm passed, there was no world, just debris, just dust, just the fading imprint of a scream in the warp and the echo of a word. Never more. Among the tumbling wreckage of a shattered skull tower, a single word-bearer refused to die. His armor had fused with molten stone, pinning him beneath a slab of half-liquefied cathedral. His flesh had cooked beneath the plates, bursting in places, leaving him a thing of blistered, blackened meat. Warp fire had licked at his soul, but not quite taken it. He hung there, half-melted, feeling every grind of broken bone, every drip of his own fat, every tick of a failing secondary heart. The darkness shifted. A figure knelt beside him, placing one hand delicately upon the fractured plate of his breastplate. It was not the towering monster that had torn apart fleets and cracked a world. This Corax was almost human in scale. He wore the idea of armor rather than the thing itself, outlines of pauldrons and greaves traced in darkness upon a body of shaped shadow. His face had more definition now, the mask sculpted into something like a man's features, though the eyes remained those unending pits. The word-bearer gurgled, blood bubbling at the ragged ruin of his mouth. What are you? He managed. Corax regarded him with a quiet, distant interest, as if studying an insect pinned to a board. Names, the Primarch said softly. I require names. The traitor blinked, confusion cutting through the pain. Names, Corax repeated. Every legionary of your brotherhood who stood on the black sands of Istvan, facing my sons. Every voice that cried for my death while the 19th died around me. Every man who pulled a trigger, who swung a blade, who watched and did nothing. Tell me. The word-bearer tried to laugh. It came out as an agonized wheeze. There were so many, he rasped. You cannot hunt them all. Corax's hand tightened on his chest. The pressure was enormous but precise. The traitor felt ribs splinter, lungs compress. He coughed a fan of blood across the Primarch's shadow face. It sizzled and vanished. "I have time," Corax said. "The galaxy gave me time. The eye gave me teeth." He leaned closer. "Tell me their names." The word-bearer stammered. He tried to speak. A few names fell from his wrecked lips, cracked and broken and half-remembered. Corax listened in perfect stillness, memorizing each syllable, each fragment. When the traitor faltered, Corax prompted him, questions gentle, almost kind. At last, there were no more words. The Primarch sat in silence for a moment, as if listening to echoes no one else could hear. Then he inclined his head a fraction. "You have been useful," he said. A shadow claw rose. "I will find the rest." The hand descended, closing over the ruined helm. Ceramite folded like parchment. Bone gave way with a crisp crunch. Brain and blood and fluid erupted between the fingers in a vile spray. The word-bearer's world ended in sudden, absolute dark. In the far distances of the warp, something that was once a man, and now a vast murder of ravens, turned and flew, trailing the latest addition to a ledger written in blood and shadow. In the age when brother slew brother, and the dream of unity drowned in its own blood, a son of the Emperor fell into the dark. Corvus Corax had been many things in the age of Crusade. Liberator, assassin, Lord of Shadows. He had loved the thrill of the silent kill and the clean certainty of a righteous blade. He had loved his sons, the warriors of the 19th Legion, enough to break himself to spare them a worse fate. He had loved an idea of justice that could survive even an imperium built on chained worlds and screaming convicts. Then Istvan burned. On that black sand, under a rain of treacherous fire, the 19th died. They died with bolter rounds in their backs and treason in their ears. They died abandoned, their gene stock poisoned by political compromise and the cowardice of men who called themselves lords. Corax watched them die. He heard them call his name as their armor cracked and their blood turned the ground to clinging mud. He carved a path through the slaughter and found that the foe he hated most walked beneath his own banners. After the heresy, there was no peace for the Primarch. There were no laurels, no quiet retirements, no soft fade into legend. There was only the knowledge of what had been done to his sons, of the weakness that had left them like that, of his own failure to see the betrayal until its teeth were already closing. He stood upon the ramparts of deliverance and looked out across the void. He thought of the 19th's broken legacy, of gene seed tainted by the Raven Guard's desperate experiments, of the hordes of pale, hollow-eyed recruits struggling to fill the ranks of a legion reduced to a chapter. He tasted ashes. One word left his lips, soft and venomous. Nevermore. It was a promise to himself, as much as a curse upon the traitors. Never again would he allow his sons to be used and discarded by distant masters. Never again would he march to war, trusting that his brothers would stand with him. Never again would he place faith in anything but shadow, steel, and his own hands. Then he went where no loyal son had any business going. He walked into the eye of terror. The warp accepted him like a wound accepts a blade. Time lost meaning. Years became centuries. Centuries. Blurred into millennia, each heartbeat stretched and layered with the screams of the lost. Corax did not die. He did not age. The Primarchs were not meant to decay like common men. They were weapons crafted by a genius that bordered on the divine. Their souls burned bright. Their bodies refused entropy. The eye took that refusal as a challenge. It tore at him. It worried at him like a pack of warped beasts worrying a chained prisoner. It crawled into the cracks in his mind where grief and rage and guilt festered. It whispered that he could have saved more of his sons if he had been stronger, harsher, more willing to do what needed to be done. It showed him 1,000 futures where the 19th lived, and the price was paid in uncounted billions of other lives. He did not break, he changed. The first time he noticed, he was standing upon a shard of dead rock, drifting through a storm of unreality. The sky was an ocean of boiling colors. Demons fought each other in the clouds, tearing and devouring, reforming and tearing again. The rock beneath his boots shuddered with every passing scream. He looked down and saw that his shadow did not move as it should. It did not cling to his heels. It did not match the curve of his shoulders or the angle of his head. It stretched away from him, longer than it should, darker than the absence of light, peeling from the stone like spilled ink. As he watched, the edge of it twitched, then twitched again, like the wing beat of some buried bird. He reached out with a gloved hand and the shadow rose to meet it. It touched him back. From that moment, nothing was quite the same. The raven motif that had once been a symbol, etched upon his armor and banners, became a living thing. The creatures of the warp that resembled birds of prey, those ragged-edged shapes of black that haunted the wastes of the eye, were drawn to him. They circled him. They perched upon him. They flew with him when he leapt into battle. Their eyes were not the eyes of natural animals. They were holes in the fabric of the world, leading down into the same vast dark that his own soul was becoming. Over long, suffocating ages, Corax and the shadow that followed him ceased to be separate things. On a demon world choked in scripture and screaming stone, he found Lorgar. The word-bearer Primarch stood upon a ziggurat of skulls, his body robed in living fire, his armor molten brass and sulfur stone. Demons cavorted around him, tearing each other apart for his amusement. The air was thick with the stink of sacrificial blood and the ozone reek of bound lightning. "Brother," Lorgar said, when Corax emerged from the storm. His voice was a choir of cultists chanting in a dozen dead tongues. "They told me you had thrown yourself into the eye in despair. They said you sought oblivion. I see they lied. You have sought promotion." The Raven Primarch had changed since the days of clean armor and crusade banners. His form was dimmer, edges blurred, as if his body were half in this realm and half in another, deeper one. The wings trailing from his shoulders were not ceramite or cloth now, but a haze of folding black, feathers of absence that cut the air. "They told me you had found faith," Corax replied. "I see you have found theater." Lorgar smiled, and the demons around him cackled in sycophantic delight. "Why have you come, Shadow Prince?" the word-bearer asked. "To ask forgiveness? To join us in the true work? The wars beyond the petty squabbles of mortals and their little thrones?" Corax did not answer with words. He moved. The distance between them vanished. One heartbeat they were separated by the breadth of a plaza paved in skulls. The next Corax was upon the steps, his talons already raking. The first blow carved letters into Lorgar's face. Not runes of chaos, but the old script of the 19th Legion, the tally marks of the dead on Istvan. The Daemon Primarch reeled, gold ichor spilling from the wounds. He raised his Crozius, a barbed, flaming thing that had once crushed the skulls of loyalists across 100 battlefields. He swung. The weapon met shadow. The impact threw up a storm of warp fire that incinerated a circle of gibbering lesser demons. Corax did not fall. He simply flowed, his body bending in defiance of anatomy. His wings swept out, a storm of cutting feathers. Brass armor parted like paper. Flesh beneath it was carved into ribbons bearing scripture. The holy texts Lorgar had etched into his own skin were peeled away in bloody strips. "You preach peace and understanding," Corax hissed, his voice a rasp of stone and the echoes of 1,000 dying breaths. "You gave my brothers only betrayal." Lorgar bellowed in something that was not pain and not rage, but some sanctimonious fusion of the two. He hurled sermons made manifest, words that became chains and spears, paragraphs that took the shape of whips and hammers. They crashed down upon the Raven Primarch like a storm of molten scripture. Corax accepted them. He let them crash against his body, let them sear his flesh and soul. He tasted every accusation, every twisted justification. He let the weight of Lorgar's faith try to bury him. Then he spread his wings. The sermon storm shredded. Letters became confetti as shadow feathers cut them apart. Sentences were torn from their lines. Whole verses, once carved on the hearts of cult worlds, scattered as dust. Corax's talons found Lorgar's throat. He slammed the word-bearer Primarch down into his own altar of skulls. The pile cracked and collapsed under the impact, skulls popping like eggs, eye sockets grinding to powder. He carved more words into Lorgar's face. Names this time, not of the traitor, of the dead. Each cut a memorial, each letter a gravestone. "You die here," Corax said. He could have done it. His talons were already poised above Lorgar's primary hearts. Shadow was already worming into the demon Primarch's essence, tasting the texture of his bound soul. A twist, a squeeze, and the warp would have swallowed a broken thing that had once been his brother. He did not. Corax released him. Lorgar lay in the wreckage of his altar, face a ruin of bleeding script, armor hanging in strips. Demons, seeing their master humbled, fled in shrieking confusion. None dared come close. "You do not deserve an ending," Corax said. "You deserve repetition." He stepped back, wings drawing in around him. The shadows that clung to him curled like smoke. "I will break you again," he promised. "And again, however long it takes." He left Lorgar gasping in the ruin of his own faith, and the eye shifted to accommodate the promise. There were other conversations. In the quiet between hunts, when the storm stilled for brief, mocking moments, Corax sat upon jagged shards of reality and spoke to a man who might have been his father. The Emperor took many shapes in the warp. Sometimes he was a towering figure of light, wrapped in thunderbolts and crowned with the halo of the Aquila. Sometimes he was a tired man in simple robes, a sword across his knees, eyes shadowed with old decisions. Sometimes he was a corpse on a golden throne, flesh blackened, cables sprouting from every inch of ruined meat. "Which are you today?" Corax asked once, staring across a flat, grey plain of ash. The figure before him wore the guise of the warrior king, armor plain and burnished, face heavy with thought. "I am what you remember," the Emperor said. "Then you are a flawed construct," Corax replied. "I remember you as distant." The Emperor's mouth quirked, the hint of a smile that never quite reached the eyes. "You are loyal," the Phantom said. "You hunt those who betrayed me. You fight in the dark where no songs will be sung. You have become what I needed you to be." Corax laughed, a hollow sound that sent ravens wheeling overhead. "I have become a monster," he said. "That is what the Eye needed me to be. To be effective here, you must be feared. To be feared, you must become fear. The line between loyalist and horror is thin, Father. I have walked it until my feet bleed." "Then step back," the Emperor said. "You have served beyond expectation. Return to the light. Gather your sons. Stand upon a wall, and let men see their Primarch still lives." "The light betrayed us," Corax replied softly. "The wall was rotten. The sons died for their brother's pride. And I made a promise." He looked down at his hands. They were taloned and long, fingers like daggers. They were not the hands that had once shaped rebellion on Lycaeus, that had freed slaves and toppled tyrants. Those hands were gone, swallowed by this place. "You speak of loyalty," he said. "Loyalty to you, to your Imperium. Tell me, Father, how loyal was the Imperium to the 19th on Istvan?" Saki. Emperor's face did not change. The eyes were ancient and heavy and impossible to read. "You are not the only one who carries that day," the Phantom said. "Your brothers remember. I remember. The cost was mine, Corax cut in, and theirs. The cost was paid with their lives, and the bill was never settled. He rose, shadow leaking from his shoulders. If I must become a monster to make that ledger even begin to balance, then I will. Better a loyal monster in the dark than another gilded liar on a throne. He turned away. Behind him, the Emperor spoke once more. There will come a time when you cannot tell them apart, the Phantom warned. Loyalty and monstrosity, justice and vengeance. Pray that when that moment comes, you still remember which you chose. In the eye, prayer was a joke. Corax did not laugh. The lesson of mercy was written in meat. On one demon world, early in his long exile, he found a fortress of the word-bearers built upon the backs of chained slaves. Men dragged war engines across plains of glass. Men were nailed into the walls as living mortar. Men labored in pits filled with screaming, boiling blood. He infiltrated as shadow. He became every darkness the ward lights could not quite banish. He slit throats in the night and hid the bodies in plain sight, folding them into every menacing angle of the fort's architecture. The killing was a rhythm, a litany with no need of words. In one of the lower dungeons, he found a cluster of slaves not yet broken. They were gaunt. Their eyes were sunken, but clear. They had not yet been marked with the 8-pointed star. They whispered the old names of the Emperor and the Primarchs in the quiet moments between shifts, clutching rusty knives and stolen bones. Corax could have left them. Instead, he stepped from the wall, let them see him. They recoiled, then dropped to their knees. "Lord," one stammered. "My lord, we thought you were only a story." "Stories are all you have left," Corax said. "Listen well." He told them where to run. He traced pathways through shadowed valleys, listed which sentry posts would be empty on which nights. He gave them timings and codes taken from the minds of the word-bearers he had already killed. He marked for them a crack in reality at the edge of the world where the warp's tide was thin. If they reached it, they might bleed into real space and find a world that was not yet entirely damned. They wept and thanked him. One tried to kiss his hand. He let them. He left them with hope. When he passed that way again, the fortress was gone. The ground where it had stood was a crater of fused black stone and glass. The air smelled of burned souls. Lorgar's sons were meticulous in their spite. Someone had not only broken the structure but unmade the memory of it. Corax dove like a knife, winging through the ruins, searching for a trace. He found it in a nearby valley. They had not escaped. They had been caught and returned. The slaves were altars now. They had been nailed to iron frameworks, limbs stretched until tendons snapped and bones splintered. Their skin had been peeled away in long, careful sheets, each strip inscribed with verses praising the dark gods and Lorgar's holy word. The flayed skins hung as banners, fluttering in a wind that reeked of seared hair and singed fat. Eyes stared down from empty sockets. Tongues had been torn out and nailed to the banners as wax seals. Hearts hung in cages of rib and wire, still faintly twitching, refusing to admit death. At the base of one such living icon, a single head had been left intact. The man's jaw was dislocated, his lips ripped away, teeth bare in a permanent grin of agony. He saw Corax. Tears leaked from the raw holes where his eyelids had been. No sound emerged from his torn throat. The Primarch stood there a long time. Mercy, he realized, was cruelty here. The eye did not permit clean escapes. Hope was bait. To offer it was to make the prey more delicious when it was taken again. He reached up and closed his talons around the nailed heart of the nearest altar. He tore it free. He moved from banner to banner, ripping out hearts, crushing them, granting what little release he could. He did it fast. He did not speak. When it was done, he set fire to the whole valley. From then on, he did not promise anyone escape. He did not tell mortals to run. He offered them only two things: a quick death now, or a slow one under the hands of their masters. Most chose his claws. The ledger grew. Demon fleets found themselves sailing into storms that had not been there the moment before. Cult battle barges plunged into clouds of black birds that stripped their hulls and their crews down to bone and scrap. Warbands gathered for grand rituals on carefully corrupted worlds, only to find their summoning circles collapsing into pits full of ravens with beaks like surgical knives. World by world, ship by ship, host by host, Corax hunted. He tore apart warlords and princes. He took apart entire conclaves of dark apostles and made their screams the choir for their own unmaking. He razed demon worlds until only dead suns remained, and around those dead suns circled flocks of ravens that were not truly birds at all, but the fragments of his own endless wrath. The dead of his private war mounted into the tens of billions. Demons who had haunted the eye since the first cities burned on Old Night were reduced to greasy stains on unreality. Mortal cults that had spanned sectors, infecting planet after planet, were decapitated in the space of a single warp storm. It was not enough. The wound in the galaxy grew. The day the great rift tore open, Corax felt it as a spear driven through the eye itself. The warp convulsed. Realms that had drifted for ages tore loose and crashed together. Demon empires were shredded, tides reversed, whole storms shrank to nothing, while new ones were born howling. For a time, even Corax lost his sense of up and down. In the chaos, he saw things. He saw the Imperium's light split down the middle. He saw a black gulf claw from one side of the galaxy to the other, a chasm vomiting demons and madness into real space. He saw his father's throne, wrapped in blue fire and tortured radiance. He saw the Indomitus Crusade, a great spear of void ships and faith and desperation, led by another of his brothers clad in shining, reforged plate. He saw Primaris warriors stepping from their cradles, giant even by the standards of the Adeptus Astartes. He saw chapters reforged, fleets rearmed, whole subsectors brought back into tenuous compliance. He saw his own sons, Raven Guard strike cruisers running silent through war zones, shadow captains leading kill teams behind enemy lines, assassinating commanders, crippling logistics, turning wars with the death of selected men. The 19th's legacy lived, thin and taut, and stained with compromises, but alive. He also saw worlds burning. He saw hive cities cracked in half by demonic claws, oceans boiled, suns devoured by warp mouths. The scale of suffering made the heresy look like the training act of a larger play. He let the visions wash through him and cling. When the storm of futures and presents and maybes abated, he was not alone. They came crawling from the ruptured horizons, crowned in horns and shadow and the skulls of conquered foes. Demon princes, lords of their own miserable parodies of kingdoms, gathered around him like carrion beasts, scenting fresh corpse. One spoke first, its voice like a chariot of bone dragged over cobblestones. "Corvus Corax," it said, "shadow of the 19th, you have carved a legend even here. You have butchered our rivals in droves. You have shown a flair for terror that would make the 8th Legion applaud." "Speak," Corax said. His voice was quiet. The ravens perched upon him ruffled, their feathers in anticipation. "We offer you ascension," the prince said, "formal ascension. Become what you already are, a demon Primarch, but loyal. You can rule mankind through fear and shadow. You can be the Emperor's lash, his unseen hand. With our patronage, your power would swell. You could save more of them." The others joined in, each adding their own soporific pride. "You could stand astride the Imperium and the warp both," one hissed. "A bridge, a blade, a god made from regret. You could end these little wars and begin a greater one," another crooned. "No more hiding, no more skulking. March at the head of your own pantheon of ravens and reap." Corax regarded them. He stepped forward, toward the one who had first spoken. His talons sank into the shifting ground, sending ripples through the skin of reality. The demon prince puffed itself up, mistaking the approach for interest. Corax reached out and placed a hand upon its chest. "You misunderstand," he said. He closed his fist. The demon prince came apart, not in a shower of gore, in symbols. Its flesh dissolved into screaming runes that tried to flee, scrawling across the air in frantic patterns. Wings of flame turned into letters. Horns cracked into punctuation marks. Eyes burst into dots and dashes that wailed in a language that had no place in mortal throats. Corax dragged every fragment back. His shadow extended, a net of black lines that caught each rune and pinned it. He squeezed. The runes compressed, shrieking until they were a dense, twitching point of ugly red light. He flicked it away into the dark, where something older and hungrier swallowed it. "I will never wear your chains," he said. "I have worn enough already." The surviving princes recoiled, their offers curdling on their tongues. They fled to rebuild their petty realms, leaving him alone in the storm once more. Alone to hear the whispers of a new atrocity. The word-bearers were talking. They liked to talk, those sons of Lorgar. Even in the Eye, where distance and time were suggestions rather than laws, they built networks of sermons and messages. Dark apostles shared plans, rituals, victories. They boasted of worlds taken, of faith spread, of new blasphemies crafted. Corax listened. He flowed through their shrines as shadow. He dwelt in the cracks of their temples, the spaces behind their icons. He perched in the corners of their vox chambers, his presence no more noticeable than a trick of the lumen strips. Through stolen eyes and stolen ears, he learned. They were constructing something grand, not a single world altar, as he had broken before, but a net, a pattern spanning sectors, linking shrines and cult cells and corrupted regiments into a lattice of belief. At the heart of it lay a plan, to seize the shadow of Corvus Corax himself, to bind the legend of the Raven Guard and twist it into a weapon of chaos. They meant to reach out from the Eye into real space, to taint the gene seed of the 19th wherever it lay, to warp the souls of those who bore it. A legion of black-armored, raven-marked warriors turned into shock troops of the dark gods, unleashed upon an imperium already bleeding. The ritual required sacrifice on an unimaginable scale. They needed shrines built on billions of backs. They needed the deaths of guardsmen and cultists and civilians across a dozen systems, each life feeding a single syllable in the great blasphemous sentence they were writing. Corax watched a conclave of dark apostles kneel before a burning map of the galaxy, its stars represented as beating, fresh-plucked hearts dangling from chains. Their crozy thumped against the stone in time with the pulse of those stars. "It will begin near Deliverance," one said, "near the wound where the Raven once perched, a cruel jest to make him watch his sons fall as his legion did on Istvan." Another chuckled. "If he still exists at all," the second murmured. "If he has not finally been consumed by the dark he embraced." Corax's talons dug into the shadow where he crouched, leaving gouges in nothing. His vow to never again stand beneath the Imperium's light weighed against what he had just heard. He had promised himself he would not return. The galaxy had moved on without him. His brothers walked the stars once more. New warriors bore new armor, new marks, new oaths. His time was a half-remembered legend, a cautionary tale told in chapter cells. He had killed so many here. Demons, traitor marines, cultists. He had raised whole worlds inside the Eye. The ledger was heavy with their names and deaths. He had become exactly what he needed to be, to make the traitors bleed. And yet, what were the deaths he had dealt compared to the deaths that ritual would demand? What were the tens of billions he had claimed against the uncounted billions it would take to fuel that binding? What did his promise weigh? When set against the suns who still fought under the Raven, the Eye was not a prison, it was a vantage point. He saw that now. From here he could strike in ways no fleet could. From here he could spill into real space in shapes no augur could predict. He flexed his wings. The denizens of the Eye felt it. Demons turned their heads as a new wind blew through their realms. Warp storms shuddered at the edge of their appointed domains. Lesser princes snarled as flocks of ravens passed overhead, blacker than the blackest storm cloud, blotting out what passed for light. Corax moved. He tore his way through feasting hosts, slashing apart warbands mid-revel as he cut a straight path through the squirming unreality. Demon worlds that got in his way cracked and sank, their tethered souls screaming as his shadow swept across them. He did not stop to tally these deaths. They were no longer part of the ledger. They were simply debris. He came at last to the boundary. The edge of the Eye was not a line. It was a region, a thinning of madness into something that could almost remember being space. Here, warp storms died, and reality clung stubbornly to its old rules. Here, the veil between the realms flickered and tore, but did not simply dissolve. A great storm boiled there, its heart a pulsing knot of crimson light, its edges frayed and wild. It had gnawed at a particular stretch of the veil for ages, wearing a hole that had never quite broken through. Corax sank his talons into it. The storm fought. It threw lightning and memories and nightmares at him. It peeled at his skin, trying to strip him down to raw soul that it could drink. He dug deeper, feeling the fabric of the warp bunch under his claws. He pulled. The storm screamed. Its light elongated, stretched into filaments that snapped one by one. Its heart tore. From within that sundered core, a shaft of something colder than the Eye's chill stabbed through. Real space. He saw stars. He saw the faint glimmer of a system he knew by shape and by story. Deliverance, his adopted home. Kiavaha, its Forge World sister. The subsector around them, crowded now with the movement of fleets, both imperial and not. The word-bearers were already moving. Corax spread his wings wide. He forced himself through the tier, dragging shadow with him, his consciousness fragmenting into a storm of ravens that howled as they squeezed through a gap not meant for anything so vast. Demons clawed at his heels, trying to ride with him. He shook them off with contemptuous sweeps of his blades. The breach widened. The edges of the Eye's wound seared, trying to scar closed. He tore them wider. He passed through. Behind him, the storm collapsed, with a sound like a dying star. Ahead of him, the void of real space waited, and in that void, a region of space where his sons still fought, unwittingly positioned as the bait in a ritual that would damn them all. He emerged in silence, a shadow without a source, a murder of ravens given purpose, a Primarch who had spent an age learning exactly how much horror it took to make monsters afraid. The Eye of Terror shrank behind him. The hunt had a new field. Kiavar burned, as it always burned. The Forge World sky was a low ceiling of smoke and furnace glow, lit from below by a billion chimneys belching refuse into the upper air. Manufactoria hives rose in jagged tiers, each level a maze of gantries and soot-blackened habs bolted onto the bones of older structures. Rivers of slag ran between the hive stacks, glowing orange through their own crusts, giving off a stench of hot metal and chemical ash that had long since killed the sense of smell in those condemned to breathe it. In one such manufactorum, a man named Hadric worked his station. He was a small thing by the standards of his age, compact and hunched from a life beneath conveyor lines. His hair had burned out years before. His scalp was a map of old scars from the times. The machine spirits had misaligned and showered sparks instead of blessings. His hands were calloused beneath synth leather gloves. His back ached. His lungs wheezed. None of it mattered. The quota mattered. The red rune on the wall that measured his line's output mattered. The thump of pistons and the hiss of steam mattered. The rest of the galaxy did not. Haedric fed stamped casings into the hungry maw of an assembly press, one after another, a rhythm so ingrained he no longer thought about it. The press slammed down. Bolts of light flared as it welded and sealed. Then it rose, spitting out the finished piece, ready to be carried along by the conveyor to another worker in another section of the vast machine. The rune glowed a sullen amber. Output acceptable. For now. Above him, beyond the manufactorum roof, the foundries of Kiavar's orbital ring flickered. Their light seeped through cracks and vents, a constant twilight that turned even the darkest corners into a vague, crimson gloom. The sky itself was a rumor told in Hab levels far above Haedric's station. He had seen it only rarely, on the day he had been conscripted into the Manufactoria, and on another day, years later, when he had been marched to a different hive as labor tribute. That memory surfaced now, unbidden, as the lights over his line shuddered. The lumen strips flickered once, twice. The rune on the wall dipped towards warning red, then steadied. Haedric paused, one casing halfway to the press. The assembly line slowed with him, as if the machine's spirit itself were drawing breath. "Keep moving!" snapped a foreman from the catwalk above, Vox's magnified voice crackling through the tannoy. "No stoppages, no excuses. The Raven Guard do not fight with empty magazines." The press slammed down. Haedric jerked his hand back, barely avoiding losing fingers. The rune brightened, offended. The lumens flickered again. They did not come back as strong. The entire manufactorum seemed to dim. Shadows grew, reaching out from under the machines like fingers. Haedric swallowed. He was not a superstitious man. He knew that machine spirits glowered, and the Omnissiah judged, but he did not pray to the Emperor in his off hours. He did not fear ghosts. He feared the foreman's lash and the cold hunger that came when the ration chutes jammed. Still, he could not shake the sense that something vast had just stepped between Kiavar and its sun. He looked up. The manufactorum roof was a patchwork of old metal and new, plates slapped over holes, pipes punching through like roots through dirt. Between two vents, there was a narrow strip of cracked translucium, a relic of a time when light from above had been seen as a blessing and not a distraction. It showed a thin sliver of the world beyond. Haedric had never seen the sky truly dark before. Even when night schedules rolled across the forges, the heavens were a smudge of rust and cloud-backed glare. Now, through that strip of stained glass, he saw black. He blinked. For a heartbeat, he thought perhaps smoke had thickened above the hive, some new plume choking off the light. Then he realized that the black was too pure. It was an absence, a disk cut out of reality itself. Around the edge of that absence, something moved. At first it looked like the flaring limbs of a corona, the angry halo that clung to the forged star when seen from the orbital platforms. Brightness limned the edges of the dark disk, not the steady blaze of a star, but a flicker, a flutter, wings. Haedric forgot the press. He stepped away from his station, craning his neck for a better view. The foreman shouted, but the words bounced off him. He wiped grime from his eyes and from the crack in the roof. The sun of the Deliverance subsector was gone. In its place hung a wound of perfect shadow, a circle of negation. Around its edge, like a crown of insects, a vast storm of ravens wheeled. Their forms were tiny at that distance, just a shimmer of motion, but they were too regular, too precise to be any natural aurora. The Vox units on the catwalk screamed. Haedric flinched as a shrill burst of static erupted from the tannoys. The foreman clapped hands to his ears, dropping his shock rod. Auspec's consoles along the wall, usually the silent domain of red-robed tech adepts, flared with scrolling lines of red rune script before going dead, screens cracking, sparks leaping. Across Kiava's hives, billions of men looked up from their labor, their meals, their prayers. Some saw only the dimming of lumen globes. Some saw the halo of ravens. A few, those lucky or cursed enough to have a glimpse of open sky, watched the last thin line of sunlight vanish. Night dropped across the forge world in a single, crushing moment. The machine spirits howled. Conveyor lines shuddered to a stop. Power surges ran through cables like lightning, exploding junction boxes, sending arcs of white fire leaping into the air. Men were hurled from gantries, their bodies breaking on the edges of vats and crucibles. Boilers ruptured, spraying superheated steam that peeled skin from bone in ragged sheets. In the depths of the manufactoria, in the hab slums and underhive warrens, the panicked screams began. They rose through the hive stacks, a chorus of fear that even the roar of the forges could not entirely drown. Far above Kiava, in the shadow of the gas giant upon which deliverance clung like a black barnacle, the Raven Spire woke to the same darkness. The fortress monastery had been carved into the very crust of the moon, a fang of rock lined with gun ports and raven-headed statues. Within its hollowed halls, lumen strips dimmed as the external sensors registered the loss of the star. Hololithic displays flickered and shifted, recalibrating to a new array of threat runes. In a chamber deep within the spine of the fortress, the lords of the Raven Guard assembled. The strategium of the Raven Spire was a long hall of obsidian and steel, its walls lined with reliefs of armor and weapons from campaigns that stretched back to the Great Crusade. At its center hovered a three-dimensional projection of the subsector, a cloud of faintly glowing icons representing worlds, fleets, and known warp anomalies. Ethan Shan stood at the edge of the hololith, gauntleted hands resting upon the lip of the projection table. His armor was black as the void, edged in subtle silver, his helm clipped to his belt. His face was pale and lean, scarred by old wounds, and shadowed by the hollows beneath his eyes. He had the look of a man who had learned to rest without sleep, his thoughts forever circling the next war. Beside him stood Kayvan Shrike, a darker shadow in a room already full of them. The former chapter master wore his armor as if it were another layer of night, the white of his beak-like helm, and the raven's wing patterns on his pauldrons the only relief. He watched the hololith with the stillness of a predator in cover, his mind already racing ahead of the data streams. Around them, other officers of the 19th's shattered legacy waited, captains in battle-scarred plate, chaplains with skull helms, tech marines whose red lenses gleamed with data, mortal officers from the Kiava defense cohorts. Servo skulls drifted between them, trailing data cables. Across from Shan, his white gloves a stark intrusion in the room's dark palette, stood the Lord Inquisitor. He wore the rosette of the Ordo Hereticus upon his chest, a stylized letter I wrought in gold and adamantium, crusted with purity seals. His armor was functional but ornate, black plates edged in silver script, a high collar framing a thin, ascetic face. His hair was iron grey, cropped close. A book bound in human skin hung at his hip, and a digital rosarius flickered at his throat. "The pattern is clear," the Inquisitor said, as Auspex servitors chattered and whined around the chamber. Astropathic choirs burned out across Segmentum Obscurus, a demon world in the eye reduced to silence. The same word echoed in every mind that survived long enough to transmit. He gestured, and the hololith shifted. A red sigil flashed above the representation of the demon world that Corax had unmade. Its icon flickered, then winked out, leaving a dead void where once chaos runes had burned. "Nevermore," he said. "A Primarch-class psychic event, a warp godling, or something close enough to make little difference." "Not a godling," Shan murmured. "A declaration." The Inquisitor's lip twitched. And declarations matter nothing if not backed by power, he said. This entity destroyed an entire demon world and its fleet. It now manifests as an eclipse across your forges. It comes here, to your home, to your gene vaults, to your recruiting worlds. You must acknowledge the threat it represents. We do, Shrike said quietly. His voice was low, but it cut through the bustle of the strategium. You mistake us if you think we minimize this. Then you accept the necessity of exterminatus preparations, the Inquisitor pressed, seizing upon the admission. If this warp entity breaches the Ravenspire or Kievar, if it shows signs of corruption beyond containment, your duty is clear. You must be prepared to burn this system rather than let it fall. Cyclonic torpedoes must be armed now, before the situation degenerates further. Silence settled for a moment. The hololith's glow painted ghost light on the black armor of the Raven Guard. Shan's jaw clenched. When he spoke, his words had the weight of stone sliding into place. We do not authorize the destruction of Deliverance, he said, nor Kievar. We will not prepare the murder of billions to appease your fear of a shadow you do not yet understand. The Inquisitor's eyes narrowed. Billions will die regardless, he said. Your reluctance to face that does not change the arithmetic. Better that they die clean, their worlds rendered down to sterile rock, than that they serve as breeding grounds for some new heresy. Shrike's gaze shifted from the hololith to the Inquisitor, then back again. Our chapter was born from the liberation of this moon, he said. Our Primarch raised the hives of Lycaeus from slavery. Deliverance is not a world we will cast away on your suspicion. Primarch, the Inquisitor echoed. Your Primarch has been gone for an age. What returns from the eye is not the man you remember. A servo skull chimed as new data streamed into the projection. Icons flickered along the edge of the subsector display. Segmentum Command is responding, intoned a tech adept, his voice buzzing through the Vox grill built into his throat. Battle fleets from 3 neighboring sectors are diverting. Crusade elements from the Indomitus reserves are en route. Estimated arrival by the Emperor's will within a span of standard weeks. The hololith blossomed with new light. Ships flickered into being as tiny spearheads of blue and green, forming rough lines of battle around the Kievar system. Regimental markers winked in alongside them, each sigil representing an Imperial Guard army, each of those formed from millions of men. Legio symbols appeared, titans marching to war. Cog runes marked Mechanicus Tagmata laid across the paths of supply. Shan watched the glow intensify, the thin ring of defenders swelling into something resembling a bulwark. The cost of that bulwark echoed inside the data. Worlds stripped of their garrisons to feed the muster. Planetary defense forces left hollow so that their best regiments could be sent here. Troop carriers crammed with conscripts, half-trained and terrified, dragged from their hive nests and agri fields, with no explanation beyond the usual litany of duty and faith. In hive cities 10 light years away, men were being herded into transports. In shrine worlds farther still, pilgrim camps were being emptied as their able-bodied were pressed into uniform. In Manufactoria like Hadrix, quotas were rising, even as the lights dimmed. Segmentum Command is not blind, the Inquisitor said. They recognize the threat. They will not allow a Primarch-level warp monstrosity to run unchecked. They respond to the symptom, Shrike said, not the disease. The tech adepts shifted runes. The hololith zoomed out, the subsector shrinking. New icons flared at its edges, red and jagged. Unidentified fleets transiting the Great Rift, announced a Vox officer. Multiple signatures. Patterns match known word-bearer configurations. Others align with Black Legion schematics. More data incoming. Their courses converge. They are making for Deliverance. The Lord Inquisitor's hand tightened on the pommel of his sword. You see, he said, the warp entity draws its allies. chaos does. Not let such weapons roam unclaimed. The word-bearers know what has risen. The Black Legion knows. They seek to crown it. Or to destroy it, Shan said, eyes narrowed as he studied the trajectories of the crimson runes. You assume allegiance where there may be only fear. The word-bearers do not fear what their own rights have birthed, the Inquisitor snapped. This is their doing, their ritual, their god. We will not entertain comforting fictions of renegade demons turning upon their masters. Shrike leaned forward, the armor plates along his spine shifting with a whisper. Unless the ritual failed, he said. Unless something else crawled from the cage they built. The reports from the Eye speak of traitor hosts annihilated, realm after realm going dark. If this were their champion, would they not be trumpeting its victories, not scrambling to catch it? The Inquisitor opened his mouth to reply. The alarms beat him to it. Klaxons howled through. The raven spire, deep bass notes that vibrated in the bones as well as the air. Warning runes flared along the strategium walls, burning crimson. The hololith shivered, its image distorting as the auger arrays that fed it screamed in protest. Gravimetric disturbance in high orbit, a serf shouted, voice cracking. Unscheduled warp fluctuation at extreme range. No translation signature, no Geller field echo. It is just there. The projection shifted to show Deliverance and the space immediately around it. The gas giant loomed like a bruise-colored god. The moon and its ring of defense platforms hung nearby, circled by a thin skin of Imperial ships. Beyond them, something was crawling into being. It was not the clean blossom of a translating starship, nor the sudden flare of an emergence from the warp. It was a wound, ragged and torn, a patch of night in the void darker than the void itself. Its edges frayed and writhed, threads of unreality whipping out and lashing the nearby auger nets. Within that wound, a vanguard of the traitor fleet waited. A cluster of Word-Bearer and Black Legion warships had translated into the system ahead of the main body, their captains hungry to claim whatever glory their masters promised. They had been sliding inwards on silent drives, weapons warming, sensing a battle they believed they would control. Now, caught between the gas giant's gravity and the opening maw of shadow, they turned. Macro batteries swiveled, lance turrets tracked. Vox orders bellowed through their decks, calling crews to stations. Gun crews strapped themselves in. Boarding torpedoes were readied, chained in their racks like leashed beasts. The shadow tore fully open. It did not disgorge ships. It vomited ravens. They came in a storm of black shapes, each the size of a thunderhawk, each less a craft than a coalescence of absence. They moved without burn or flare, ignoring the physics that bound proper vessels. Augurs marked them as negative returns, holes in the scan, impossible vectors. They hit the vanguard. On the bridge of a Black Legion strike cruiser, the captain watched his tactical display blossom with impossible contacts. They flickered in and out of existence, slipping through firing arcs faster than batteries could traverse. "Point defense, all quadrants," he snarled. "Kill those things. Launch boarding countermeasures. Prepare to repel." The deck beneath him shuddered, not with the impact of enemy cannon fire, but with something more insidious. The lights dimmed. The air temperature dropped. Frost crept along the edges of the cogitator consoles. The pict screens fluttered, snowed, and then showed corridors full of ravens. They were everywhere. They erupted from ventilation shafts and bulkhead seams, each one a serrated shadow. They cut through armor and flesh and deck plating with equal disdain. Crewmen flailed as their limbs came away from their bodies, hands still clutching tools, or weapons as their owners collapsed in pieces. Astartes in blackened brass raised bolters too slowly. The ravens sliced through their armor joints, decapitating them, carving their torsos into neat segments that fell in clattering heaps. The boarding torpedo decks died in silence. The men waiting within those cylinders of steel never left their tubes. The ravens flowed through, their blades carving the occupants into chains of offal that slid down the launch chutes. When the storm passed through a section, it did not leave random carnage, it arranged. On one vessel, the crew of an entire gunnery deck were flayed and stacked along the bulkheads, their skins pinned to the ceiling in patterns that, from the right angle, formed the spread wings of a raven in flight. On another, the bodies were impaled on their own bayonets, forming a spiraling column of meat that twisted around the main stairwell. Blood hung in globes in the thin atmosphere, drifting slowly until shadow beaks pierced each bubble, drinking. Millions died in those first minutes, their lives vented into the void or spent as decorations in corridors that no loyal eye would ever see. In the Strategium, the hololith showed the Vanguard fleet's icons flickering, blinking out one after another. No lance fire marked their deaths, no exchange of broadsides, simply removal. Shrike watched, face unreadable. "This is his work," he said. The Inquisitor's hand hovered near the Vox rune that would connect directly to the Exterminatus assets in orbit. His fingers twitched, then stilled. "Or the work of what wears his skin?" he said quietly. Shan did not answer. His eyes were on the wound in space, on the darkness that now began to flow inward, towards the orbit of deliverance itself. The holiest sanctuary of the Raven Guard lay at the heart of the Raven Spire, deeper even than the Strategium. It was a cavern of hewn stone and adamantium, its walls lined with statues. Each was a towering representation of a battle brother of renown, heroes of campaigns long gone, their deeds immortalized in cold metal and carved rock. At the far end of the hall, raised upon a dais of black marble, stood the largest of them all. Corvus Corax looked down upon his sons. The statue showed him as he had been at the height of the Great Crusade, tall and lithe, wings of sculpted ceramite folded behind him, a spear in one hand, the other outstretched. His features were stern but not unkind, eyes cast towards some distant horizon only he could see. It had been a focus of quiet devotion for 10,000 years. Many of the chapter's rituals began or ended beneath that gaze. The gene vaults lay beneath it, chambers where the precious organs of the 19th were guarded as zealously as any relic. Now, the shadows at the statue's base began to move. They thickened, they pooled, pulling away from the corners of the chamber, sliding along the floor like oil. Torch flames, guttered, leaning towards the gathering mass as if drawn by some inverted gravity. A small honor guard of Raven Guard stood watch, veterans in plain black, their helmets off in this sacred place. They shifted uneasily as the light died, hands moving toward their weapons. One of them dropped to one knee without thinking. "Father," he whispered, a prayer more than a word. The shadow climbed the statue. It flowed up the carved legs, over the sculpted armor, swallowing the clean lines. The stone wings behind the Primarch blurred and then dissolved as something else took shape around them. The outstretched hand became a taloned limb of darkness, fingers ending in points that gleamed with a hunger for flesh. The statue ceased to be a statue. It ceased to be anything but scaffolding. The figure that stepped down from the dais was the same height, the same rough silhouette, the same proportions that had been burned into the gene-coded memories of every Raven Guard, but where the statue was stone and reverence, this was movement and intent. Its edges writhed with razor feathers, each more absence than substance. The face was a pallid mask, smoothed of human detail, save for the hollows where eyes should have been. Those hollows drank the honor guard's gaze. Some of the warriors dropped to their knees, heads bowed, hearts hammering in armor that suddenly felt too small. "Father," one said again, voice stronger now, "by the throne, it is you." Others raised their bolters, training muzzles on the thing that had stepped from their icon. For all their conditioning, for all their legends, they were still Space Marines. They had seen too many demons wear familiar faces. The doors to the sanctuary opened. Shan entered, Shrike at his shoulder, the Inquisitor and his retinue a pace behind. The Lord of the 19th halted as his eyes took in the scene. The statue he had known only from pict feeds and half-remembered Juvenat tales stood gone, its place taken by a living shadow. "Stand down," Shan said, his voice low but carrying. "Lower your weapons." He did not know whether he spoke to the honor guard or to the part of himself that wanted to draw his own pistol. The shadow turned its head. For the first time since stepping through the wound in space, Corvus Corax looked fully upon his sons. "Shan," he said. The sound of his voice was not a single note. It was the echo of many voices overlaid, the whispers of ravens, the hiss of wind through broken hives, the distant thunder of guns on a black sand beach. Kavan. Shrike felt something in his chest tighten at the sound of his name. The old stories had painted their Primarch in many ways, stern but fair, savage in battle yet gentle with his own. The thing before him did not match those tales, and yet, in the angles of its head, in the way it assessed the men before it, there was familiarity. "Father," Shan said, and the word did not feel like blasphemy. "You. Remember us." Corax's head tilted, like a bird studying an unfamiliar prey animal. "I remember the line," he said. "You are not the same, but you are of it. Your souls taste different." The Inquisitor stiffened at the phrasing. "Taste?" he said sharply. "What do you mean by that, creature?" Corax did not turn toward him. He continued to look at Shan and Shrike. "The gene wrought by our father has been spliced and reforged," he said. "New warriors birthed with new strength. Primaris, they are named in some foolish quirk of pride. The flavor of their souls carries his hand more strongly, yet they lack the scars of what we endured. They are sharper blades, perhaps, but unblooded in the ways that matter." Shan's mouth tightened. "We have done what we must to survive these ages," he said. "With or without you." "Without," Corax agreed. "Until now." The Lord Inquisitor stepped forward, Rosarius glowing. "Hold," he said, voice ringing with authority. "By the rights vested in me by the holy orders of the Emperor's Inquisition, I command you to submit, entity. You will be bound, examined, and tested. You claim the name and form of a Primarch, but your essence is steeped in the warp. You are an abomination until proven otherwise." The honor guard tensed. Bolters lifted again, this time uncertain where to point them. Corax's head turned. The emptiness of his eyes fell upon the Inquisitor. There was no visible motion beyond that small shift, no raising of hands or flaring of wings, yet the chamber seemed to twist. The Raven Guard felt themselves somewhere else. They stood on black sand beneath a toxic sky. Their armor was not the pattern they knew. It was older, bulkier, its plates engraved with the marks of a legion, not a chapter. Titans strode in the distance, their footfalls shaking the ground. Gunships roared overhead, and then the fire fell. They felt the impact of the first barrage as a physical blow. Their armor locked, their lungs seized. The sky turned to streaks of incandescent death as orbital guns, once sworn to protect them, rained down annihilation. Men they knew, and men they had never met, screamed beside them, their bodies turning to red mist under the storm. They saw the 19th Legion die. They saw the 8th and the 17th and the other traitor legions pour fire into their brothers' backs. They saw Primarchs standing aloof as the massacre unfolded, their faces unreadable behind armor and helms. They felt bolter rounds smashing into their own chests, tearing out lungs and hearts. They tasted blood and cordite and betrayal. Through it all, they felt Corax. They felt his fury as he realized the trap. They felt his despair as he watched his sons fall. They felt the iron determination as he carved a path through the killing field, dragging the survivors back into some semblance of order, the weight of each dead warrior settling on his shoulders. The vision broke. They were back in the sanctuary, breath coming harsh and ragged, hearts pounding. Sweat slicked their backs despite the cooling systems of their armor. Some had tears on their cheeks without remembering when they had begun to fall. The Lord Inquisitor stood rigid, face pale beneath his hard discipline. His hand had clenched on his rosarius so tightly his knuckles were white. Corax regarded him. "This is what I am," he said quietly. "Not a title, not a construct. A memory that refuses to die. A wound that learns to bleed back." His gaze did not waver. "Tell me, Lord of Interrogations, you who speak of necessary purities, has your order ever paid such a price in blood for its certainties?" The Inquisitor opened his mouth, closed it, the chamber waiting for an answer that did not come. Shan stepped in before the silence could rot. "You did not come only to show us the past," he said. "You came because something is moving in the present. The fleets, the darkness across our star, the word-bearers." Corax inclined his head. "They weave a net," he said. "They mean to bind my shadow and your legacy together and drag both into the service of their gods. The fleets converging on this subsector are not raiders. They are threads in a ritual. If they are allowed to take position, if they are allowed to spill enough blood in the right places, the 19th will be theirs. Body, soul, gene seed, all of it." Astropathic servitors twitched and shuddered in their alcoves along the walls, mouths bubbling as they tried to grasp the currents Corax spoke of. Their eyes glowed faintly, burned from within by psychic after-images. "Our own choirs have seen echoes," a chaplain rasped. "Fire on every horizon, shrines raised upon hives, planetary defense forces turning in a single night, whole worlds chanting in tongues not their own." "Billions of voices," Corax said, "waiting to be cut. Their deaths will power the binding, unless we take the knife first." A new projection flared in the hololith. Corax moved to the table, his presence dragging shadows with him. With a gesture, he tore through the careful formations laid out by Imperial tacticians. Battle lines scattered, pickets shifted. Icons that represented worlds were pulled out like beads on strings. He drew something new. "Here," he said, tapping a cluster of hive worlds. "And here, and here. They will strike first. We let them. We fall back from these worlds, not in panic, but in design. We make them think their plan is working. We give them blood in such quantity that they cannot resist pursuing." Tiny crimson markers blossomed over the worlds he had indicated. Each represented a population measured in the billions. "Those worlds will die," Shan said. There was no question in it, only a statement. "Yes," Corax said. "Their fates are already bound. The word-bearers have seeded there, cults. The Black Legion has placed its cells. The knife is already at their throats. You can throw your armies into the gap and maybe buy them time, but not salvation. Not without losing the larger war." Shrike's gauntleted hand tightened on the edge of the hololith table, ghost light crawling over the raven motifs on his armor. "And the other worlds?" he asked. "The ones you do not mark as bait." "We fortify them," Corax said. "We make them look like the heart of our defense. We let the traitors believe they are the true focus of the ritual, while we instead carve the heads from their hosts. Decapitation strikes, assassinations, terror. We bleed their dark apostles dry. We shatter their command before the final syllables can be spoken." He drew a talon through the projection. Red icons representing traitor flagship clusters shimmered, then split, then faded. Shan stared at the map. "You would have us abandon whole worlds," he said. "Billions of our people, men who have done nothing but labor and pray. You would write them off as misdirection." I would have you recognize that they are already condemned, Corax replied, voice colder than the stone beneath their feet. The only question is whether their deaths will serve only the word-bearers, or whether we can make them buy us leverage. Istvan took my legion. No one paid for that. The interest on that debt has been accruing for a very long time. The words hung in the air like a sentence. Shrike met his Primarch's gaze. We are not monsters, he said. We are not the Night Lords, to tally up fear as coin and spend lives like ammunition. Corax's head tilted. You have been fighting a war of attrition for 10,000 years, he said. You know the numbers. You know how many die in your raids, in the enemy's reprisals, in the collateral you cannot avoid. Do not pretend your hands are clean. The difference now is only honesty. The Lord Inquisitor found his voice again. For once, I find myself in agreement, he said, with the principle, if not the practice. The Imperium exists because we are willing to burn whatever we must to hold the line. But I will not cede strategic authority to a warp-touched revenant whose loyalties are unproven. Corax's gaze slid over him, dismissive. I do not ask your permission, he said. I offer a plan that uses what I am to counter what they are becoming. You can choose to reject it. You can throw your fleets into a heroic stand over every world in this net. You will be remembered as brave, perhaps, for however long there is anyone left to remember. Shan closed his eyes for a heartbeat. He saw Kiavar's hives under a sky gone black. He saw the mortals there, men like Hadric, crushed under machines that had no concept of the war above them. He saw them choke and burn and die for sins they had never committed. He saw Istvan's sand and the 19th, drowning in their own blood. When he opened his eyes, they were hard. We commit, he said. Shrike's jaw tightened, but he inclined his head. We will need kill teams ready to move as soon as the traitors show themselves, he said. We will need infiltration routes and extraction corridors. We will need the exact locations of their dark apostles. I will provide them, Corax said. I have lived in their thoughts for longer than you have been alive. I know their habits, their prides, their favorite scriptures. They will not see you coming if you are willing to walk in the same dark I do. The Lord Inquisitor slammed a fist into his chest in fury. This is madness, he snarled. You sentence entire worlds without trial. You dance to the tune of a half-demon Primarch. I will not endorse this butcher's calculus. I will transmit my objections to Segmentum Command and to Terra itself. The High Lords will do as they have always done. Corax cut across him. They will debate while men die. They will issue decrees when the blood has already dried. Let them. We have work that cannot wait upon their comfort. He turned his back on the Inquisitor, a calculated insult in a culture where to turn away from a threat was either supreme confidence or suicidal folly. No one moved to strike him. Orders began to flow. Fleet captains received new coordinates, their battle lines bending around the worlds marked as bait. Generals on hive worlds saw their expected reinforcements diverted to other fronts. Some screamed into their voxes, demanding explanation, threatening mutiny. They received calm, measured responses laden with honorable phrases. None of them said plainly that their worlds had been sacrificed. On Kiavar, Hadric and the billions like him returned to their machines as emergency lumens flickered back to life. The sky above remained dark. The halo of ravens around the absent sun turned, slow and patient, watching. In the Ravenspire, Corax faded back into the shadows at the edge of the sanctuary, his form dissolving into a cloud of feathers that crawled across the walls. The first moves had been made. The traitors were coming. The Imperium, as ever, would answer with blood. This time, though, the shadow that fell over Deliverance did not belong solely to the enemy. War lit the subsector like a plague of suns. From the height of the Ravenspire's strategium, The campaign could be reduced to icons and numbers. 12 hive worlds, each a swarm of metal and flesh wrapped around a dying core. 3 forge worlds, their atmospheres a soup of chemicals and radiation. Fleet anchorages on bleak rock balls. Mining moons gnawed hollow by centuries of extraction. Agri worlds stripped into regimented furrows of grain, meant to feed armies, not people. Every one of them was aflame.
Remember, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support helps.
Red runes crawled across the hololithic projection, marking worlds under direct assault. Amber runes blinked on. Others, indicating uprisings, cult activity, insurrection. Deep beneath those colors, a quieter tally recorded the dead, billions and climbing. Factories that had once turned out laser guns and shells now vomited smoke from their own ruined guts. Hive cities that had scraped the sky burned from their foundations to their highest spires, molten rivers of plasteel and bone pouring out through ruptured walls. Void stations spun slowly, their atmospheres vented, their crew frozen into grotesque statues that orbited their own corpses. This was the ledger the war would be written upon, not in ink, not in scripture, in lives. On Caris Ultima, the ink was still wet. The command bunker lay beneath the primary hive like a tumor carved into the bedrock. It was a warren of vox pits, cogitator banks and cramped offices, all humming with the ceaseless nervous energy of a world trying to coordinate its own salvation. At the center of it all, Lord General Martin stood before a wall of hololithic displays and tried to decide which of his cities he would let die first. He was tall for a baseline human, shoulders broad beneath his flak cloak, the lines of his face cut deeper by sleepless nights and rationed stims. His hair was iron grey, clipped close. Scars crawled up his neck from a long-ago artillery misfire. He had commanded campaigns on 4 worlds. He had lost men by the 100,000 and slept anyway. He had never been asked to abandon billions. The displays showed the hives of Caris Ultima as glowing towers, their spires capped by defense platforms and macro cannon batteries. Each tower had rings of green and red marks around it, representing his regiments and the enemy's. The greens were thin, the reds were thickening. A junior officer, vox beads threaded through his scalp, pointed to a cluster of icons. "If we concentrate the armor here," the aide said, voice hoarse with overuse, "we can blunt their advance into Hive Barris." The word. "Bearers are committing heavily to that front. If we hold Barris, we hold the primary manufactoria. Lose Barris and the rest of the hives will fall in time." Martin's jaw worked. "The order from Deliverance is clear," he said. "We pull back from Barris and the outlying hives. We contract our lines around the Continental Redoubt. We let them take the cities." The aide stared at him. "Let them," he repeated, as if the words were acid. "My lord, Barris holds close to 1 billion souls. The outliers together are more. You would abandon them to the traitors?" "I would obey my orders," Martin snapped, more harshly than he intended. He looked away, eyes tracing the paths of red icons, pushing inexorably inward. "Apparently, that is how we win this war." "This is not winning," the aide said. He was a young man, younger than Martin by decades, with a thin face and a haunted look that had deepened with every day of the siege. "This is handing our own people over as meat. We still have forces in place. We can hold at least some of the hives. The Astartes could reinforce. The Titans could—" "The Titans are already committed," Martin cut across him. "The Astartes are ghosts on the Auspex, hit and run, never in numbers enough to anchor a defense. This world is not the only front. We bleed so that others do not have to." He tasted the hypocrisy, even as he said it. The Vox unit on the wall hissed. Martin turned, expecting another panicked report from a frontline commander. Instead, the static resolved into a shape. Blackness leaked from the Vox grill, pooling on the floor, rising like smoke given purpose. The lumen strips dimmed. The aide stumbled back, hand going to the last pistol at his hip. "Stand down," Martin said, though his own hand itched for the comforting weight of a weapon. He had seen picked captures. He had heard the astropathic whispers. He knew this shape. It coalesced into a man's outline, tall and lean, armor suggested in shadows, wings carved from night. The face was a pale mask, without human warmth. Corvus Corax looked at him from the Vox, present without presence. "Hesitation killed the 19th on Istvan," the Primarch said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It cut through the bunker hum like a bolter shot. They had minutes between realization and annihilation, minutes in which to recognize betrayal and act. They spent those minutes trying to save everyone. They saved almost no one. Martin swallowed. "We are not on Istvan," he said. "These hives have not betrayed us. They are ours. My men can still hold the walls." "For how long?" Corax asked. "Long enough for the word-bearers to spill the exact measure of blood they need in the exact places their ritual demands. Long enough for your regiments to die with them, feeding both the butcher's bowl and the ledger of their gods. Our duty is to defend Imperial citizens," the aide said, anger giving his voice a brittle edge. "Not to trade them away like currency." Shadow flickered along Corax's shoulders, the suggestion of feathers ruffling. "Your duty," he said, "is to the survival of the Imperium, not to the comfort of its illusions. These people are already dead. The moment the word-bearers marked this world in their black liturgies, their fates were sealed. You can let them die in ways that strengthen the enemy, or you can use their deaths to break the ritual that would enslave a legion." Martin closed his eyes for a heartbeat. Behind his eyelids, he saw Barris Hive as it had been before the war, towers gleaming under a polluted sky, hab blocks packed with men like Hadric at their machines, children playing in alleys between refuse piles, preachers on street corners promising salvation through toil. He opened his eyes again. "If we pull back," he said slowly, "my men will call me Butcher. The Hivers will curse my name as they die." "They will die cursing someone either way," Corax said. "Better you than me. I am used to it." The Primarch's head tilted. "Make your choice, Lord General. Do not take too long. Every minute you wait adds another line to their account." Martin looked at the hololithic map. "Signal all fronts," he said. His voice felt as if it belonged to someone else. "Execute contingency Shadowfall. We abandon Barris and the outlying hives. All forces are to fall back to the redoubt line. No stragglers, no civilian convoys. Any regiment that fails to withdraw in good order will be left behind." The aide stared at him, horror in his eyes. "My lord!" "Get it done," Martin said without looking at him. The Vox shadow was already fading, sinking back into the grill. "Good," Corax said. "Do not mistake this for mercy, General. Mercy is for after the war, if there is an after." When the traitors came, Caris Ultima was ready in its own way. The hives that had once bristled with guns and regiments now bristled only with their own dead. Gates stood open. Defense batteries were silent. Civilians jammed the avenues, screaming and praying and smashing each other in their frantic attempts to reach transports that would never arrive. The word-bearers entered as conquerors, banners snapping, armor polished as much as centuries of foul service allowed. They marched into streets knee-deep in their enemies' fear and congratulated themselves on how easily the Imperium broke. They did not see the shadows change. In the alleys between hab stacks, darkness thickened. On the ceilings of Manufactoria, where lumen globes flickered and died, something moved. For every raven that flapped and cawed in the poison sky, 1,000 more took shape in the corners of rooms, under guttering shrine candles, in the spaces beneath rusted staircases. Corax split himself. He had practiced this for a long time in the eye, fragmenting his will into manageable blades, sending each to cut along a different line. He did the same now, but with more focus. Each sliver of himself carried a directive, a list of targets, a sense of the kill. An armored column of word-bearer tanks rolled through a valley between two hives, tracks grinding over wrecked vehicles and the bodies of those too slow to flee. The valley walls were high and bitten with cave mouths where hab blocks had once clung. The sky above the armored column went blacker than the smoke. The word-bearers in the lead tank saw nothing at first. Their augers glitched. They assumed it was interference. Then the commander reached for the Vox, and his hand came away without fingers. Blood sheeted the console. He stared at the stump, confusion warring with pain. Something moved in the turret, not a person. An absence. The gunner's head slid off his neck, dropping into his lap. His body remained upright for several heartbeats, hands still on the firing controls. Then the rest of him sagged, organs slipping out through the clean cut at his collar. In the next tank, the driver felt something wet drip onto his face. He wiped at it, expecting oil. His hand came away red. He looked up. The commander in the cupola above him had been rearranged. His torso hung upside down, legs folded behind his head, spine exposed and gleaming, his head twisted around to stare down into the compartment with empty eyes. No shot was fired to announce the ambush. The ambush was the crew coming apart. By the time the last tank in the column juddered to a halt, engines still idling, every man inside every vehicle was either dead or in the process of discovering new ways to die. The ravens that had done the work burst from open hatches and vision slits in a storm of feathered knives, spiraling upward toward their next assignment. In a macro battery tower overlooking another hive, the gun crews had been ordered to shell the retreating Imperial lines, to turn the open ground before the redoubt into a wasteland of craters and carbonized corpses. They sweated as they worked, stripping down macro shells the size of tanks, feeding them into the hungry breaches. The first sign they had that something was wrong was the silence. The thump of boots on metal, the shouted orders, the whine of servos, all died at once. The air seemed to hold its breath. The lumen strips along the tunnel ceilings flared, then popped, showering sparks. Then the ravens came. They erupted from the mouths of the macro cannon, a reverse storm. For an instant, 1,000 black shapes filled the cannon barrels, their wings scraping along adamantium. Then they flowed backward, out through the breaches, through the loading rooms, through the corridors. Men became chopping boards, hands flew, faces vanished, ribs were opened from behind, spines plucked free like harp strings. One gun crewman, trying to reach for the alarm, found that his arm ended at the elbow, with no sensation of the severed forearm, until he saw it hit the floor and bounce. By the time the macro batteries fell silent for good, their crews were red paste stuck to the walls. The barrels, still glowing from earlier firing, steamed with vaporizing blood. In the Ravenspire, the War Council watched the casualty counts flicker and climb. Shan, Shrike, the Lord Inquisitor, a Lord Solar drafted from one of the crusading fleets, and a Magos of Kievar's ruling Mechanicus stood or floated around the hololith. Servo skulls whispered casualty estimates, planet by planet. Vox links crackled as new reports came in, each worse than the last. "We are losing entire hives," the Lord Solar said. His uniform was immaculate despite the long hours, his sash of rank streaked only with the shadows cast by the projection. "Our fallback lines are holding for now, but we are bleeding our strength away. Even if the traitors are overextending, the price is payment," Corax said. He had appeared, without fanfare, a tall figure of shadow behind the Inquisitor. No one saw him arrive. One moment there had been only the silhouettes of men and machines. The next, there was something taller and leaner and wrong, its edges out of focus. The Inquisitor stiffened, hand halfway to the weapon at his hip. "This strategy is indistinguishable from heresy," he said through gritted teeth. "You sacrifice worlds as if they were pawns on a board. You engineer massacres rather than prevent them. This is not defense. This is butchery." Corax's hollow gaze slid over him, then came to rest on the Lord Solar. At Istvan, the 19th lost tens of thousands in a matter of hours, he said. His voice had the tired rhythm of someone reciting figures too many times. The 17th and the 8th and the others used them as target practice, while pretending to stand as brothers in arms. On other fronts during the heresy, worlds burned by the 100. Casualties climbed into the high billions. That was the cost of your first betrayal. He gestured lazily at the hololith, talons tracing lines through icons of dying worlds. In the 10,000 years since, your Imperium has bled, slowly, steadily. Wars of compliance, wars of rebellion, campaigns against Xenos and heretics. The numbers grow, trillions dead if you still bother to count. They die in dribbles, they die in floods, their ledger is long. He looked back at the Inquisitor. What I offer is not heresy, he said. It is consolidation. We condense the inevitable deaths of this campaign into places that matter. We kill more now, so that fewer die later. Or we refuse to do so, and the enemy wins both in bodies and in souls. The Magos clicked and whirred. Casualty projections if the ritual succeeds, he said, voice synthesized through layers of Vox filters, indicate sector-wide collapse. The traitor forces would possess a corrupted mirror of the 19th's doctrines and gene code. Their terror capabilities would multiply. The number of Imperial citizens who would die in the subsequent centuries is non-trivial. That is an understatement, the Lord Solar muttered. Shan's gaze did not leave the shifting map. How many have died so far in this campaign? He asked. Across all fronts. The Magos' mechadendrites twitched as he summoned data. Confirmed deaths across the 12 hive worlds currently engaged, he said, exceed 4 billion. Projections, accounting for unreported casualties and planetary data lag, raise that number towards 6. On the Forge worlds, confirmed losses approach 900 million. Secondary theaters increase the total further. Current estimate places the dead in the low billions. The war has not yet reached peak intensity. The Inquisitor's lips thinned. And you would increase that willingly, he said to Corax. Corax's wings shifted. I would make it mean something, he replied. On a Forge world whose name mattered only to the tithe schedules and the dead, the meaning was written in molten metal and blood. The Legio engines strode through seas of wreckage, their titanic steps shaking factory lines apart. Warlord titans, their carapace mounts spitting plasma and missiles, traded blows with demon engines that writhed with the faces of the damned. Skitarii legions advanced in ranked waves, galvanic rifles spitting light, only to be torn apart by warp fire and twisted claws. Above the chaos, void shields shimmered, bubbles of protective energy surrounding the titans. Around them, the air shivered with the pressure of the guns and the screams of the dying. In the head of one warlord, Princeps Halvar sat in his throne cradle, nerve plugs sunk into his spine. He felt every step of his god engine as a jolt in his own bones. Auspec's readouts fed directly into his mind. He tasted the oily stink of the demon engine's warp spore as a sourness on his tongue. Bring main lance to bear, he murmured. Target the iconoclast at bearing 39. Fire when ready. The Moderati echoed his commands, their own voices distant in his perception. The warlord's spine flexed. Its massive headgun spat a beam of white sunfire that carved through a demon engine's carapace, blowing out a chunk of its rune-engraved hide. Warp flames burped from the wound, howling faces pouring out. A flicker crossed his vision. For a heartbeat, the world inside his mind went dark. No auspex, no readouts, no sensation from his titan's limbs, just a feeling of cold. Then a shape was there, in the cramped sanctum of the warlord's command throne. A tall, lean figure of shadow, wings folded tight to avoid brushing the sacred machinery. Halvar had no time to shout. Talons closed around his head. He felt his skull crack. He heard the wet crunch of bone giving way. pressure built behind his eyes, a growing agony that burst in a blinding flash as his orbits were crushed. His last sensation was of something scooping at his brain like a man reaching into a bowl for meat. The warlord shuddered. Without its princeps, the god engine faltered. Its stride staggered, void shields flickering. In the same moment, ravens erupted from its vision slits and minor hatches, streaking away towards nearby demon engines. Inside those demon engines, where bound warp entities screamed in caged joy, the ravens found hearts that were not hearts. They tore. Demonic cores burst. Hellfire flared as engines that had rampaged for centuries died with the death squeals of 1,000 souls, compressed into one last orgasm of horror. Metal bodies, plated with trophies and sigils, collapsed in on themselves, leaving twisted heaps of dead iron and smoking ichor. To the Skitarii on the ground, it looked like a miracle. Their god engines toppled, but their foes fell with them. They did not see the shadow that passed through both, turning victories and losses into lines on someone else's ledger. Not all of Corax's lessons were taught to the enemy. In the dim hangar deck of a Raven Guard strike cruiser, a captain knelt before a hololithic projection of a hive. It showed the sprawl of the city beneath its smog dome, the lightning-scarred spires, the crawling antlines of fleeing civilians. Word-bearer tithe fleets orbited above, their drop craft rising and falling in a steady tide, unloading more killers with every cycle. "They still fight," the captain said. His armor was plain, marked with the winged skull of his chapter and the squad sigils of 100 battles. His voice trembled only a little. "The planetary defense forces hold 3 of the outer bastions. We can break the siege. A precision strike, a decapitation of their command. A bombardment will erase everyone, loyal and traitor alike." His company stood behind him, a line of black armored giants, helms held at their hips, watching in silence. Corax stood, opposite the captain, the hololith's light passing through him. "You were given coordinates," the Primarch said. "You were given a timetable. You were told that this hive is one of those we sacrifice." The captain lifted his head. "I know the ledger," he said. "I know the numbers. I know that this war cannot be won clean. But they fight, my lord. Men of the Imperium, our people. We can save some of them. Let me try." Corax stepped forward. If he had been entirely real, the gesture would have brought him nose to nose with the captain. As it was, it brought the hollow pits of his gaze within a hand's breadth of the man's eyes. "Do you know how many men I tried to save on Istvan?" he asked. "Do you know how many I actually did?" The captain swallowed. "I have read the histories," he said. "Histories," Corax repeated, contempt in the way the word twisted. "Words on parchment, numbers in margins. They do not show you the screaming. They do not show you the eyes of the ones you leave behind when you pull back too late." One of his hands moved. The captain did not see it. One instant he was kneeling, his spine straight, his gaze locked on his Primarch. The next, he felt a strange lightness. He looked down and realized he was seeing his own legs from a new angle. His torso had been cut cleanly, from shoulder to hip, along a line that severed spine and organ and armor alike. His upper body slid from his lower body, intestines slipping out in a wet mass. His heart pumped once more, spraying a fan of blood that painted the deck. Then the world tipped and the floor rushed up. The company did not move. Their captain hit the metal with a final, ugly sound. His 2 halves twitched, then lay still, smoke rising from the cauterized edges of his carapace. Corax looked up at the assembled warriors. "Sentiment is a luxury the dead have already paid for," he said. "You will fire when I tell you. You will kill who I tell you. You will not mistake pity for duty." He turned away, wings trailing. Behind him, the captain's company knelt as one, helms touching the deck. "By your word, father," their sergeant said, voice steady despite the blood pooling around his knees. The night of a billion screams began with a whisper. Across the subsector, cogitator banks glitched. Noospheric channels filled with static. Auspex arrays returned nonsense, their displays a wash of glyphs that meant nothing to the men who watched them. Astropathic choirs, already raw from overuse, clutched their heads and moaned as a new pressure throbbed through the warp. Then the lights went out. On 12 worlds at once, continents plunged into an unnatural dark. Not the honest dark of planetary night, but a thick, living thing that swallowed sound as well as sight. Stars vanished from the skies, even where the haze of war did not already obscure them. Moons dimmed, city lumens shorted. Even the glow of fire seemed muted, as if reluctant to illuminate what shared the shadows. On one agri world, a platoon of guardsmen sat around a cooking fire in a crater, their rations heating in battered tins. The night had been clear, the stars bright. They had been joking, comparing scars, pretending not to hear the distant rumble of artillery. Then the fire winked out. Someone cursed, someone laughed nervously, assuming a stray gust had taken the flame. Then men started to vanish. Not all at once. One by one, the presence of a comrade simply ceased, the place where he had been filled with air and confusion. A hand groped in the dark for a familiar shoulder and met only emptiness. Voices called names and received no answer. The ground grew slick under boots, but no one could see on what. By morning, when the darkness lifted like a curtain at an unseen signal, the crater was full of bodies. They lay in neat rows, each man staring at the sky with eyes that no longer saw anything. Their throats had been opened in the same place, the cuts so fine that on some, the blood had only begun to seep when the killing was done. Their rifles were stacked in a careful pile at the crater's edge. On a hive world, a hab-block filled with men who had refused the call to arms discovered that refusal did not grant exemption. They had boarded themselves in, barricading doors with furniture and scrap. When the dark fell, they huddled together, listening to the distant screams and feeling their courage leach away. The first raven squeezed under the door without moving the furniture. It was shadow, not substance. Where it passed, wood blackened and flaked. By the time they smelled blood, it was already too late. On a mining moon, cultists gathered in a cavern carved into the bones of the satellite, ready to complete a sacrifice timed to the word-bearer's ritual. They chanted. They raised knives. They waited for their dark apostle's signal. Something else answered. The dark in the cavern thickened. Their candles guttered. A single voice whispered nevermore into 1,000 skulls at once. Then the ravens fell, and the cult died in a storm of cutting wings and shredded flesh. Not even loyal worlds were spared. Corax did not have the luxury of precision on this scale. Where he sent his darkness, it hunted anything that moved, anything that breathed, anything that could add weight to the numbers he needed. Loyal guardsmen died beside traitor Astartes. Innocent workers died beside shrieking heretics. The dead did not care who they had been. By dawn, the first counts began. On 6 worlds, tally clerks stared at the numbers compiling on their slates and went pale. The magos in the Ravenspire collated reports, cross-referenced them with projections, and finally spoke. The night's operation claimed over 2 billion lives, he said. The majority appear to be cultists and traitor auxiliaries, but loyalist losses are non-negligible. Corax did not. Corax, answer. His form was half dissolved, perched in the rafters like a swarm of watching birds. Interrogations continued. Captured Dark Apostles were not easy to break. Their faith was a shield against pain. Their souls already pledged to horrors greater than anything a mortal could do. Corax was not a mortal. He did not sit them in chairs and ask them questions. He flayed their minds in the warp while flensing their flesh in the material. He peeled their thoughts away like skin, exposing the raw, quivering truths beneath. He hung them from their own icons by their own entrails and whispered questions into the open cavities of their chests. Some never spoke. They still told him everything he needed to know with their silence, the patterns of their resistance revealing the lines of the ritual. A cardinal world had once stood at the heart of the subsector, its surface covered in shrines and pilgrim roads. It had been a jewel in the ecclesiarchy's crown, a place where billions came to crawl on their knees toward relics they believed held pieces of the Emperor's grace. Now the projections of that world showed a different pattern. Its continents had been reshaped, seas boiled away, cities demolished and rebuilt according to a geometry that had nothing to do with efficient habitation. From orbit, its landmasses now formed a vast sigil, a rune of such scale that it could only be seen from space, the ritual nexus. "The entire war has been pushing us here," Shrike said, as the hololith spun, showing the cardinal world from different angles. "Every retreat, every sacrifice, every cut we have made in their ranks. They are trying to drive us into the teeth of their altar. And we are letting them," Shan said. His voice was hoarse. He had watched too many casualty reports scroll by, too many cities turn from green to red. Corax lingered at the edge of the projection, the outline of his wings blending with the shadows cast by the fortress. Lighting. "And now we know where to cut," he said. The fleets turned. In the void between stars, engines burned. Loyal armadas came about in great arcs, their prows swinging toward the corrupted cardinal world. Behind them trailed the scars of the campaigns they had already fought, hulls pitted by lance fire, shields patched with emergency generator rigs, decks still slick with dried blood. Opposite them, the traitor fleets did the same. Word-bearer battleships and Black Legion cruisers burned steadily, their course vectors converging on the same point. Between them moved other, lesser warbands, drawn like flies to the promise of a grand atrocity. In the viewing galleries of one Raven Guard vessel, Shan stood with Shrike and watched the stars crawl. "They follow him," Shrike said. He did not specify whether he meant the loyal fleets or the traitors. "They follow the gravity of the war," Shan answered. He simply nudged its path. He was silent for a long moment. "When I was made chapter master," he said at last, "I imagined what it would be like if our Primarch returned. I thought of banners, of oaths renewed, of a clear line between right and wrong, drawn by his hand. And now?" Shrike asked. "Now I am not sure if we follow a Primarch," Shan said, his eyes on the distant corrupted world, "or a monster that happened to wear his face once." Shrike watched the reflection of the void on his gauntlets. "Does it matter?" he said quietly. "We no longer have the luxury of doubt. We have only the enemy and the choice of how we kill them." Behind the viewing gallery, in the dark between lumen strips, ravens clustered on the pipes and beams, watching with eyes that were not eyes at all. Corvus Corax added another line to his ledger and spread his wings towards the feast to come. From orbit, the world no longer looked like a world. Where once oceans had shone blue and green under a forgiving star, there was now only a single titanic glyph, a rune of bone and brass and liquefied flesh carved across the face of the planet. Continents had been shattered and reassembled into curling strokes and knife-edged angles that formed the sigil of a god that had never needed a name. Mountain ranges had been ground down to teeth. Valley systems had been filled with skulls until they overflowed, bleached white and stained brown with old blood. The seas were gone. In their place, basins of congealed gore fumed beneath a heavy sky. Vast plates of flensed skin floated upon those blood seas like dead leaves, edges curling, tattooed with scripture that crawled and rearranged itself in time with the pulse of the planet's heart. Fat bubbled on the surface in thick yellow blooms. Islands of fused corpses drifted, locked together in death by rivulets of cooled viscera. Cities that had once been shrines for billions had been pulled apart and welded into the lines of the symbol. Cathedral towers lay on, their sides, spires pointing not to the heavens, but toward the center of the rune, as if every prayer ever spoken on this world had been dragged inward and nailed to a single point. Every death across the war had run along invisible channels and collected here. Every guardsman who fell on some distant ridge, every hab worker torn apart in a riot, every cultist cut down in the dark. Their souls were hooks, sunk deep into this altar, feeding it. Above that abomination, the fleets came together. Loyalist armadas knifed through the void, their prows wreathed in the light of their own weapons. Imperial Navy battleships, kilometer-long slabs of armored hate, locked their gun decks to bear. Escort squadrons darted and flared, screening the heavy hulls. Mechanicus arc ships glided behind, hunched and insectile, their spires bristling with sensor arrays and forbidden armaments. Opposite them, the traitor fleets advanced. Word-bearer battle barges, their hulls carved with scripture that burned like fresh brands, formed a line of crimson and black. Between them moved Black Legion cruisers, their void shields glittering like rotten jewels. Raider flotillas, flying the marks of a dozen lesser warbands, jostled at the fringes like carrion birds, eager for scraps. They met above the cardinal world like hammers. The first salvos were almost ritualistic, patterns of lance fire and macro cannon shells exchanged to test shields and resolve. Spear-bright beams stabbed across the void, gouging glowing trenches in hulls. Explosive shells the size of hab blocks sailed between the lines, their impact turning armored decks into clouds of molten iron and red ice. Then the range closed, and the ritual became slaughter. An Imperial cruiser took 3 lance strikes along her spine. Armor boiled, internal bulkheads ruptured. Men and women at their stations were flash-frozen, or burned to ash in an instant, their bodies blown from rents in the hull to fan out behind the dying ship, like a trail of glittering dust. The vessel listed, her engines still firing, before a final macro cannon hit slammed into her prow, snapping her in half. Both halves spun away, venting atmosphere and crew into the void. A word-bearer battle barge drove through a cloud of Nova shells, its shields flaring and collapsing in rapid sequence. Shells tore open its flanks, spilling broken gun decks into space. Macro cannons, still loaded, still manned, still fired even as they tumbled, the shots searing harmlessly into the darkness. Torpedoes launched from their tubes, spiraled wildly, and detonated among their own escort vessels, shredding them. Bodies filled the emptiness. Crewmen in void suits tumbled, their lines severed, drifting forever. Those without suits flared with frost as the emptiness took their warmth, their eyes cracking, their tongues swelling and splitting in mouths frozen mid-scream. Fragments of men and ship mingled, indistinguishable. Boarding actions raged in, corridors wreathed in fire, vessels burned from stem to stern. An entire enemy squadron vanished in an instant as the warp spat and swallowed them, misjumps forced by the turbulence of so much death. Casualty estimates in the Strategia would later speak in dry terms of hundreds of millions dying in the void. But in the moment, there was no counting, only the raw sensation of endings. The planet below accepted the corpses that fell to it like a greedy child catching sweets. Escape pods burned brief streaks through the atmosphere before coming apart, skins blistering, contents going from men to cinders to dust in a breath. Larger fragments of ship hull punched through the air in blazing arcs, trailing auroras of flame to hammer down into the already broken crust, sending up fountains of blood and bone. Through that hail, through the rain of wreckage and the glare of orbital bombardments, came the landers. Drop pods fell in their tens of thousands at first, then hundreds of thousands, then more. They roared through the atmosphere, ablative plating searing away, leaving contrails that crisscrossed the blood-red sky. Some made it to their deployment patterns and flared, retro rockets slamming them into the surface in controlled crashes. Others were ripped apart mid-descent by airburst shells and demonic fire, spilling screaming Astartes and guardsmen into the open air to tumble and break. Transports followed, great slab-sided troop ships packed to bursting with regiments. Many never even reached the upper atmosphere. Flak storms caught them, shredding their hulls, turning their human cargo into smears against the inside of their own compartments. Some burned all the way down and hit the ground as incandescent meteors, the soldiers inside reduced to a uniform layer of ash that spread like powder over the battlefields. For every vessel that died, another came behind it. The scale of the assault was such that the loss of a single regiment meant little on the charts. On the ground, it meant everything. Trooper Callan hit the dirt face first when the pod's retros failed. He had known fear on the way down. The entire regiment had. The drop bay had been filled with the stink of men trying not to show it, the rattle of loose gear, the hiss of gases vented by the pod systems. Preachers had walked the aisles, tapping each guardsman on the head with a brand, murmuring blessings that sounded more like apologies. Callan had clutched his laser gun and thought of nothing. Thinking led to remembering, and remembering meant images of his home hive, his brother on the assembly lines, his father's hands shaking as he had saluted him goodbye at the mustering square. Better to keep the mind blank, better to be a weapon. There had been a lurch as the pod detached, a scream of re-entry, the sensation of his stomach being left behind as gravity played its games. Then a flaring bloom of light as something outside hit them, and the world turned into a mess of spinning free fall. When the wreckage finally stopped rolling, Callan found himself lying on a bed of something soft and slick that stank of iron. His webbing had snapped, his helmet was gone, his ears rang. He pushed himself up, spitting a tooth and blood, and realized that the softness beneath his hands was not mud. It was people. The pod had ripped open as it came apart. The regiment had been flung out. They had hit the ground in a rough circle, packed as tightly in death as they had been in life. Limbs tangled, skulls cracked. Some had died on impact, bones driven through organs, spines severed. Others had survived long enough to drown as the pool of blood under them deepened. Callan lurched to his knees. Around him, faceless helmets stared at the sky. A lasgun stock jutted from one man's chest, where the impact had driven it through armor and ribcage. Someone's arm lay across his lap, fingers still twitching reflexively. He retched, bringing up the last, tasteless nutrient bricks he had eaten on the ship. The landscape beyond the ring of bodies swam in his blurred vision. Once, this had been a pilgrim plain. He recognized the bones of it from the briefings, the wide expanse where worshippers had gathered before marching into the shrine cities. Now it was a field of organic wreckage. Buildings had been grown from flesh. Walls of stacked torsos rose and fell, their surfaces studded with faces frozen mid-chant. Roads were paved with rib cages, their arches creaking as tanks rolled over them. Great mounds of organs steamed where the ground had been torn open, and the planet's own entrails poured out, mingling with those of the dead. On the horizon, a titan waded through mountains of corpses, each step sinking knee-deep into the press of bodies. Its carapace guns threw lances of light that carved trenches through advancing demon hosts. Knights, smaller but no less fierce, rode at its heels, their chainswords howling as they plunged, into creatures the size of hab blocks, cutting through limbs that oozed souls as well as blood. Overhead, the sky was alive with the contrails of falling men and machines. A flicker of movement caught Callan's eye. He turned and saw his regiment. They were arrayed in a ragged semicircle, not far from his own crash site, as if some unseen hand had paused them mid-deployment. Their uniforms were scorched, their lasguns raised. Mouths were open, frozen on the edge of war cries. They were also lacking most of their flesh. The warp blast had peeled them. Their skin hung from them in tatters. Muscles steamed, exposed to the filthy air. In some, bones shone white amidst the red, ribs visible from the outside and the inside, because everything between had gone. Eyes were gone from sockets, leaving black holes that dribbled jelly and fluid. None of them moved. None of them breathed. The blast had flensed their souls as well as their bodies, leaving only hollow shells posed in parade. Ground perfection. Callan laughed. He laughed because there was nothing else to do. The sound came out high and cracked. It made no sense in his own ears. He clutched his laser gun and forced air past lungs that tasted of copper and smoke and madness. Somewhere beyond this little circle of horror, war raged as planned. Commanders moved pins on maps. Primarchs played games with billion-strong lives. Here on the ground, one man crawled through the ruins of his regiment and realized that whatever gods ruled this place did so with their eyes closed. In the heart of the world altar, the gods' books were being balanced. The cathedral hive that had once been the cardinal's seat of power now rose as a tower of bones and brass at the very center of the planet-spanning sigil. Its lower levels were clogged with the dead, stacked in chambers and corridors, until gravity itself protested. Higher up, the walls were lined with fresher work. Pyramids of skulls mortared with entrails, chandeliers made from spines, altars carved from fused femurs. Word-bearers filled the nave, chanting. They knelt or stood in ranks, armor smeared with blood, helms tipped back to expose faces that had long ago stopped being quite human. Their voices throbbed through the structure, a continuous low roar of scripture. Demons cavorted among them, lesser warp things with too many limbs and too many mouths, prancing over the mounds of organs, splashing in the runnels of blood. At the far end of the nave, a dais rose, built from the ribcage of a titan. Upon it, the chosen Dark Apostles performed the final cuts, their crozier flashing as they blessed the last sacrifices. Chains rattled, knives rose and fell, the floor drank greedily, the torches went out. There was no warning. One moment the cathedral was bathed in a greasy orange light, the sources of which bore a suspicious resemblance to burning fat. The next, the flames guttered and died, smoking in their sconces. The rune, inscribed in the air above the altar, flickered. For a fraction of a heartbeat, the word-bearers chanting faltered. The shadows on the walls detached. They peeled away from their places like wet paper, thickening as they moved. They slid down columns carved from the fused bodies of saints. They oozed across mosaics made from enameled teeth. Where they gathered, the air turned cold. The first traitor did not have time to draw breath for a shout. One moment he was kneeling, his mouth open in praise, his tongue forming the syllables of a god's name. The next, his head was in two halves, each cut so cleanly that the brain remained in place for a moment before gravity asserted itself and the halves slid apart. Bits of skull and grey matter tumbled down his front, painting his chest plate in glistening lumps. Another tried to bring his bolter up. Shadow slid across his arm, and it fell away from his shoulder, still holding the weapon. Blood fountained from the stump, then froze, into needles mid-spray as the temperature dropped further. Intestines blossomed from bellies, spilling in sudden, messy flowers. The shadows were not neat. They carved with purpose, but not precision. They opened men from groin to throat, and hung their entrails on the icons above the altar, looping them like garlands. They flayed faces from skulls in a single swipe, leaving teeth bared in bone that no longer had lips. Brains spattered across scripture. Hearts bounced down the steps of the dais, leaving bright red stamps on each tread. The chanting became screaming, then gurgling, then whispers, then silence. At the center of the nave, amid the falling gore and the collapsing heaps of butchered Astartes, Corvus Corax took shape. He rose from the floor like smoke given spine. Wings unfolded, reaching up toward a ceiling carved with images of other gods, their faces scratched away and replaced with the 8-pointed star. His body was a column of darkness, his limbs defined by the absence of light. Only his face held any brightness, a pale mask catching the last glimmers from the dying rune. He looked up, through stone and bone and brass, to the very apex of the world altar. There, above the cathedral hive, standing at the nexus point, where every line of the planetary sigil converged, waited the one he had come to break. Lorgar Aurelian, once Primarch of the 17th Legion, now Demon Primarch of the Wordbearers, stood upon a platform made from the welded skulls of saints. His body was robed in armor that moved like molten scripture, lines of burning text sliding across his plating, vanishing, reappearing elsewhere. His eyes were pits of sermon fire. A halo of bound runes circled his head, each one a chained heresy. "Brother," Lorgar said, his voice rolling through stone and flesh alike. It reached Corax in the nave, as clearly as if the two of them stood arm to arm. "You came. The gods said you would. They showed me ravens blackening the sky. It is poetic." Corax's wings rustled. "You have always liked the sound of your own voice," he replied. "You came to my world once with your books and your preachers and your false humility. You turned faith into a lever, then cried surprise when it broke the throne you stood beneath." Lorgar smiled. "We only revealed the hollowness beneath the dream," he said. "We showed men that the Emperor was no god, that his vision was as flawed as those he raised to enact it. We gave them something greater." "You gave them shackles they can never see," Corax said. "You gave them masters they cannot reach." He began to rise. The walls of the cathedral bowed outward as he passed, stones cracking under the pressure of his passage. Pews and pillars burst into splinters. The corpses he had made were dragged into the air by the backwash of his ascent, spinning in slow, grisly arcs before being dashed against the walls. He punched through the roof in a shower of bones and brass. Outside, the air above the world altar was thick with fumes and the stench of concentrated sin. The lines of the sigil glowed faintly, channels of energy pulsing towards the platform on which Lorgar stood. Demons clustered along the edges, watching with too many eyes, their outlines wavering as the ritual's power twisted the space around them. Corax rose through that, a spear of shadow, and came to rest on a parched expanse of fused bone some distance from his brother. Lorgar spread his arms. "Look at what we have made," he said. "A world turned into a word. A sacrifice so grand the gods themselves attend. This is the culmination of 10 millennia of work." "This is a ledger," Corax said. "You have been running up the balance for longer than that." Lorgar's eyes narrowed. "You have become what they wanted you to be," he said, almost gently. "Can you not see that? A creature of fear, a hunter in the dark, a story men tell their children to. Make them behave! You are terror given wings, Corvus. You are a weapon of the very powers you pretend to despise." "I am not their weapon," Corax said. He stepped forward. "I am their fear." Lorgar laughed. "Fear," he said. "They do not fear you. They fear losing you. They love you, brother. You are their favorite sort of toy, righteous, wrathful, blind, killing in their name while screaming that you stand alone. Lay down this pretense. Accept what you are. Join us. You could have your sons back in ways you cannot imagine." Corax's reply was a storm. He moved faster than any mortal eye could track, a blur of black crossing the distance. His first blow hit Lorgar squarely in the chest, talons biting deep into demon-forged plate. The impact hurled the word-bearer Primarch back, smashing him through the ring of hovering runes. Each rune detonated as he passed, flaring burning scripture onto his armor. The platform of skulls buckled, cracks radiated out. Some skulls shattered, their powdered remains whipped up into whirling clouds. Lorgar snarled, wings of his own flaring. They were not the clean, feathered things of old angelic art, nor the shadow constructs of Corax. They were slabs of burning text, each feather a line from his damned book, each plume a prayer inverted. He hurled words. Sentences became spears of golden light that streaked across the gap, impaling the ground where Corax had standing instants before. Paragraphs became chains that tried to wrap the Raven Primarch, sentences constricting, every letter a constriction on his will. Corax cut through them. Ravens poured from his body, flocks of razored shadows, each bird a fragment of his hate. They met the incoming scriptures in mid-air. Feathers cut letters, beaks tore verbs. The very language of Lorgar's faith was shredded, falling away as black confetti that evaporated before it reached the ground. For every chain that broke, a shockwave rolled across the battlefield. Men died in their thousands as the air convulsed. Mortal bodies were pulped under the invisible fists of warring gods. Whole platoons were pancaked into thin layers of meat between their own armor and the ground. Tanks flipped, their crews turned into soup inside their hulls. Titans stumbled as shockwaves hit their void shields, flickering the fields. Some fell, their massive forms smashing down in slow, inevitable collapse, crushing regiments under their bulk. Spire towers around the altar toppled like felled trees. They broke as they fell, rains of masonry and bone cascading down upon the fighting below. Those stones were not mere rock. They had been built from compressed bodies and hardened blood. When they shattered, they spread that history across the battlefield in a choking cloud. Demons roared as ravens descended upon them in concentrated storms. A greater demon of the blood god raised an axe the size of a defense tower and brought it down, cleaving a trench through the ground and the men upon it. In the same heartbeat, a flock of shadow birds swarmed its head, slicing into its eyes, its nostrils, its tongue. They burrowed into its skull, cutting as they went, and burst out the back in a fountain of steaming warp ichor. The thing collapsed, its essence streaming away as a howling mist. Everywhere around the central duel, lesser battles shook and broke under the secondary effects of each Primarch's blows. Corax drove Lorgar back step by step, every impact carving chunks from the demon Primarch's armor. Where the word-bearer's ichor spilled, it did not steam or evaporate. It crawled, forming new letters that writhed along the ground like maggots. Ravens swooped to peck at those, devouring them, their beaks cracking open script as if it were bone. Lorgar braced, Crozius blazing. He swung, and this time the weapon connected. The maul smashed into Corax's right wing, a flare of rune fire bursting from the impact. Shadow screamed, the sound a piercing shriek that made mortal eardrums rupture in their thousands. Corax staggered, one wing shorn away, blade like feathers tumbling around him. The word-bearer seized the opening. He threw his sermons. Entire chapters of belief slammed into Corax's mind, concepts honed over centuries, the weight of millions of chanting voices compressed into single, heavy ideas. Lorgar tried to crush his brother under guilt and doubt, and the promise of absolution if he just stopped fighting. Corax accepted them all. He let the words hit. He let them sink. He felt each accusation. He listened to every twisting justification for every atrocity. The weight grew. He did not bow. Instead, he broke, not himself. The dark that had been clinging to him, held in rough imitation of a coherent form, could no longer bear the strain. It tore. Corax dissolved. His outline came apart in a burst that was not light, but anti-light. He became a vortex of ravens that screamed as they spiraled outward. For an instant, there was no single Primarch, only a storm of blades. They spread. The sky over the altar darkened. Across the entire visible horizon, from Blood Sea to Corpse Mountain, the air filled with birds. They whirled in formations that hurt the eyes, patterns barely glimpsed before they shifted. Their wings beat, and the sound was not the soft whisper of ordinary flight, but the roar of 1,000,000 knives being drawn at once. They fell. They fell upon traitor and demon and loyalist alike. Beaks hacked, claws raked. Wherever there was life, they cut. A word-bearer's arm went one way, his head another. A demon's multiple limbs were snipped off in a flurry of slices, leaving it stumping and thrashing until it, too, was reduced to ribbons. A line of guardsmen disappeared. Every man opened from chin to groin in the space of a heartbeat, their organs spilling in a wave that the birds skimmed through, leaving trails in the steaming mess. Titans roared as their carapaces were swarmed, crew compartments suddenly full of shrieking shadows that turned whole command crews into red fog. Knights stumbled as their reaction systems failed, their pilots reduced to headless torsos slumped over controls. The casualty count climbed beyond anything sane minds could hold. Millions died, then tens of millions, then hundreds. On the surface alone, the numbers vaulted into the billions within mere hours. Men who had survived days of hell on other fronts found their stories ending in the span of a single scream. The demons loved it. They drank the fear. They rolled in the blood. They swelled with each end. Each life released added fuel to the ritual lines that still pulsed across the planet. Corax turned that flow. He had seen the structure of the rite in the minds of the dark apostles he had shredded. He felt the channels now, humming with the agony of the dying, feeding towards the nexus point where Lorgar, wounded but unbroken, struggled to reassert his form in the midst of the Raven Storm. Instead of letting that power reach the gods it was meant for, Corax grasped it. He stretched himself thin, filling the channels with his own presence. The souls of the sacrificed were not grains of sand to him. They were faces. They were names half heard in dying breaths. They were weights already added to his ledger. He twisted. The flow shuddered. The billions of deaths meant to empower chaos instead turned, their force redirected. They smashed back along the lines of the ritual, slamming into the demon armies like a collapsing wave. Demon legions winked out. There was no discharge of light, no cinematic explosion. One instant they were there, clawed feet sinking into the flesh soil, tearing their enemies apart. The next, they were simply gone, their essence snuffed, their howls cut off mid-note. Lesser warp entities, the little gnawing things that clung to the edges of reality, burned away in a psychic wind. The shock reached Lorgar. He staggered as parts of his soul, bound into the legions he commanded, were ripped free. Chunks of his being went with them, torn away like flesh on a hook. His armor cracked. His halo of runes imploded, the sigils shrieking as they were annihilated. The scream that left his throat was not a sound any mortal could hear and live. Those who were close enough for it to reach their ears died instantly, their brains rupturing against the inside of their skulls, blood spraying from eyes, noses, and mouths. Corax gathered himself out of the storm. The raven vortex funneled inward, coalescing first into a towering column of darkness, and then into a more familiar shape. Wings refolded, limbs solidified. The pale mask of his face reformed, lines harsher now, edges more jagged. He hit Lorgar like a hammer. Talons drove into the demon Primarch's chest and shoulders, pinning him to the fractured platform. The bone and brass under them gave way. Skull fragments exploded. Around them, ravens wove themselves into bars. They linked wingtip to wingtip, claw to claw, forming a cage of interlocked talons and beaks. It snapped shut around Lorgar, enclosing him. Each bar was a strip of Corax's hate, each joint a murder made manifest. He began to rip. He did not go for the heart. He did not strike the head. Those were mercies. Instead, he found seams in the demon flesh and pulled, peeling strips away like pages from a book. Words came off with them. Verses of Lorgar's scripture, once carved into his body as a living testament, came free in bleeding sheets. Corax read some as they dangled, recognizing twisted fragments of truth buried under layers of self-serving lies. He tore each one in half and let the pieces fall. Lorgar writhed, his form trying to blur, to slip away into the warp. The cage held him in place, every bar a denial of escape. "Death would be mercy," Corax said. His voice was a rasp, carrying the weight of the screams echoing through the world. "You do not deserve mercy." He leaned close, his mask inches from the ruin of Lorgar's face. "You will heal," he whispered. "You will scrape yourself back together in whatever pit you now call holy. You will build new sermons, new cults, new atrocities, and I will break you again and again. Every time you raise your head, I will be there to drive it back into the dirt." He straightened. The cage contracted, Lorgar's body compressed, bones snapping, ichor spraying through the bars. Demonic flesh bulged between talons, then squeezed through, leaving greasy smears. His scream rose in pitch until it was beyond hearing, a vibration felt in teeth and bones. Then the cage opened, not outward, but downward. It became a funnel, a chute, directing what remained of the demon Primarch not into the ground, but into the warp itself. A tear opened beneath him, hungry and red. The force of his own scream dragged him through. His form stretched into a long, howling thread of bloody script that burned as it fell. He vanished, sucked back into the immaterium, broken and humiliated, his hold upon this world severed. The altar shuddered. Without its anchor, the ritual could not sustain itself. The immense energies pent up in the sigil lines had already been disrupted by Corax's redirection. Now they had nowhere to go. Cracks spiderwebbed across the planet's crust. The lines of the glyph glowed white-hot, then black, then exploded. Whole segments of continent blew outward, flung into the upper atmosphere as jagged slabs of bone and iron and flesh rock. The blood seas boiled, then flashed to steam, blasting into the sky in towering columns that carried chunks of flayed meat with them. Canyons opened under marching armies, swallowing them. Cities, already ruins, collapsed further, their foundations dropping into yawning chasms filled with churning magma and writhing, exposed organs. In orbit, Auspex shrieked, "Planetary instability reaching critical," a Vox operator shouted on a Raven Guard flagship. Crust collapse cascade in progress. Atmospheric integrity failing. "We have to clear the gravity well now, or we will not break away." Order ran along the Loyalist formations, like a lightning strike. Engines, already strained by the battle, screamed as they pushed their hulls away from the dying world. Some had taken too much damage. Their reactors failed. They burned where they were, caught in the blossoming spray of debris. Traitor ships, those that still existed, tried to flee as well. Some were caught too close. Great chunks of planets slammed into them, tearing them open, their insides spilling into space. Others made it to the edge of the well, only to have their warp drives misjudge the turbulence and cast them into some other, more private hell. The cardinal world died. It did not explode in a single cinematic fireball. It came apart like rotten fruit crushed in a hand. Segments tore, loose, and tumbled. The core ruptured, spewing streams of molten metal and liquefied soul matter into the void. A churning vortex of blood and shadow took its place, a wound in reality that slowly, grudgingly, began to scar over. In low orbit, amid the rain of debris, a figure hung in the dark. Corvus Corax stood upon nothing, his feet resting on a patch of shadow that had as much substance as he chose to give it. Around him, shards of the world he had broken drifted. Splintered spires, chunks of altar. Frozen waves of blood turned to crimson glass. His form flickered. For a moment, he looked almost as he had in the days of Crusade. A man in armor, wings folded, features sharp and human. The next heartbeat, the edges of that form blurred, dissolving into a haze of ravens that swirled around a hollow core. He was both and neither, an idea of a man wrapped around a void. In the bridges of 100 ships, men and Astartes looked up through their viewports, and saw him there. Vox. Channels, already heavy with cries for aid, with damage reports, with the endless litany of war, faltered. Words died on lips. Fingers hovered over rune consoles without pressing. Silence fell, one channel at a time. No one knew what to say. A Primarch had saved them, perhaps. A warp monster had slaughtered billions more than the enemy ever could have. A legend had returned, wearing a shape that did not fit any tale they had been told. Corax did not speak. He looked down at the ruin of the world altar, then up at the scattered fleets, loyalist and traitor alike, bleeding in the void. Somewhere, someone reached for a Vox rune to address him, to hail him, to demand account or to offer thanks. Their hand froze. The ravens that made up his wings shivered. Then, without fanfare, without a sound, the figure in the debris folded into itself, becoming a tight knot of shadow that shrank and vanished, leaving only the wreckage and the memory. On every ship where his presence had been seen, men exhaled the breath they had not known they were holding. No one found words for what they felt. Terror, gratitude, revulsion, awe. The ledger had a new entry now, written in planet-sized script. The debt, Corax knew, was not done. The war ended the way all great imperial victories ended, with silence and numbers. In the years that followed, scribes in dim archive vaults would scratch quill across parchment, trying to make sense of the butcher's bill. They would tally worlds and lives with the same cramped hand, as if the two weighed the same upon the page. Dozens of planets scarred or dead. Hive cities ground down to glass and ash. Forge worlds with half their continents scraped clean. Mining moons left as tumbling skeletons in broken orbits. Agri-worlds stripped of soil and seed, their fields sown only with bone. Casualty estimates for the campaign around Deliverance and the Cardinal world settled. Eventually, somewhere between 20 and 30 billion human lives extinguished. Not counting those who had died nameless in the eye. Not counting those whose souls had been erased so completely that even the warp had nothing to say of them. Untold demons had been shredded into nothing. Entire chapters worth of traitor Astartes had vanished, their gene seed pulped, their names crossed out on lists carved in deeper, darker places. On the data slates, beside the inked figures, someone wrote a single word: victory. Even the men who filed those reports knew it tasted wrong. On the Lord Solar's flagship, the war ended with voices. The Strategium chamber was vast, a cathedral turned inside out. Instead of saints and relics, its walls were lined with hololithic emitters and tactical cogitators. Instead of an altar, its center held a globe of light that represented the subsector, still flickering from battle green and blood red to the muted tones of aftermath. Ethan Shan stood at the lip of the projection, armor dull from weeks of constant. Where, Helm Mag locked at his belt, Kayvan Shrike stood a little behind and to his side, as he always did, the hunched stillness of the hunter coiled in his frame, despite the trappings of command. The Lord Solar paced, hands clasped behind his back. His uniform, miraculously, still bore the crisp lines of the parade ground, though his eyes showed the exhaustion of a man who had signed too many death orders. The Lord Inquisitor watched them all, rosette glinting at his throat, face carved into a mask of piety and suspicion. Beside him hovered a magos, mechadendrites whispering as they shifted, red robes rustling. Around them, guard commanders stood in clusters, some still in armor streaked with gore, others in fresh uniforms that did not quite hide the tremor in their hands. Servo skulls drifted, relaying snippets of Vox traffic and casualty updates in thin metallic whispers. "We must decide what he is," the Lord Solar said, without preamble. Shan did not ask who he meant. No one in the chamber did. "A Primarch," one of the guard generals said. "He saved this fleet. He broke the ritual. Without him, this sector would be a charnel house and nothing more." He is a weapon, the Magos corrected, vox tones flat. The distinction matters. The machine that functions is not the artisan, it is the tool. A tool we do not control, the Lord Inquisitor said. A warp entity that wears a revered face to lend its slaughter legitimacy. A being that has butchered billions with the same emotional weight you or I attach to changing a coat. You would raise that up as hero? There are worlds already doing so, another commander put in, a grizzled man with a bionic eye. On the fringes, Vox sermons hail the Raven of Deliverance. The story spreads quicker than we can censor it. An unseen hand that annihilated chaos where all else failed. Men need something to believe in. They have the Emperor, the Inquisitor snapped. They have a corpse on a throne, the General muttered. Not quietly enough. The Lord Inquisitor's gaze cut to him like a blade. Before he could speak, Shrike's voice entered the space, soft and harsh at once. If we declare him traitor, Shrike said, what then? We move fleets against him, assassins, we fail. And in failing we teach every watching eye that even the Inquisition's writ has limits. If we declare him saint, the Magos said, we feed a different heresy. Devotions may be targeted. Belief in the Imperium itself becomes conditional upon the continued favor of a warp-touched murder god. The Lord Solar sighed. So we stand between, he said. We neither sanctify nor outlaw. We pretend he is an unfortunate anomaly, a ghost story we refuse to acknowledge even as it stalks our halls. That is not an answer, the Inquisitor said. That is cowardice. It is survival, Shan said quietly. All eyes turned to him. You speak boldly, for one whose gene father now consorts with the warp, the Inquisitor said. Shan's mouth tightened. My gene father, he said, spent 10,000 years doing what we tell each other is righteous and then refuse to do when it becomes uncomfortable. He hunted the traitor Primarchs in their own realm. He tore down demon worlds. He did not stand in chambers such as this and debate. He moved. And now he moves in our space, the Inquisitor replied. Among our people. He sets himself above our laws, our chains of command. That cannot be allowed. Cannot be stopped, the Magos corrected again, almost absently. There is a difference. The Lord Solar opened his mouth to drag the conversation back to some semblance of order. The shadows moved. They did not lengthen with any change of lumen strength. They simply shifted. The darkness pooled in one corner of the strategium, deepened, and then detached itself from the wall. Corvus Corax stepped out of the black. He had chosen a smaller shape for this intrusion, closer to the size he had worn as a man, though still taller than any Astartes present. His armor was defined enough to recognize as such, all black and razor lines, but its edges bled into nothing. His wings were folded, a cloak of serrated feathers that seemed to drink the light. The pale mask of his face caught the glow of the hololith, twin dents where eyes should have been filled with something that was not any color men had words for. No alarm sounded, no servitor called warning. For a heartbeat, the chamber simply froze. Do not let me interrupt, Corax said. His voice did not echo. It did not need to. It was simply there, in every ear, as intimate as a whisper, as inescapable as gravity. The Lord Inquisitor recovered fastest. You stand in a holy flagship of the Emperor's navy without sanction, he said. His hand rested on the pommel of his sword, though even he did not draw it. You have consorted with the warp. You have sacrificed entire worlds without authorization. You have employed psychic terror on a scale that defies quantification. By the authority of the Ordo Hereticus, I accuse you of heresy and demand your submission to judgment. Corax regarded him in silence for a long moment. Judgment, he repeated. You wish to weigh my actions. Very well. He turned his head slightly, taking in the hololith. With an idle gesture, he summoned images from its stored archives. Glimpses of the campaign flickered around them, A hive burning, a demon world turning inside out, the cardinal planet imploding. I have spent 10,000 years doing what the Imperium has been too frightened to do, he said. While you squabbled over doctrine and borders, I hunted your true enemies where they slept. I broke Primarchs in their lairs. I raised shrines in the eye. I took the war to the only place that mattered, and I did not ask permission of men who hide behind titles. The Lord Inquisitor's jaw clenched. At what cost? He demanded. We have the numbers. 20 billion, perhaps 30, dead in this campaign alone. Whole hives abandoned, worlds written off as bait. You speak of justice with lips stained in so much blood that the word loses all meaning. Corax's gaze shifted. He looked at Shan. How many died on Istvan? He asked. Do you know? Not the round figures the historians give. The real numbers. The ones no one carved on any honor roll because they were too ashamed. Shan held his gaze. It was like staring down a cliff face made of night. He felt his heart beat harder. More than I can count, he said. It was not evasion. It was acknowledgement. Hundreds of thousands of Astartes, Corax said, turning the words back toward the Inquisitor. Millions of mortal soldiers. The opening stroke of a war that would take uncounted worlds. All because men like you missed the warning signs, or saw them, and chose not to act. He stepped closer to the table, talons clicking softly on the metal. I have paid for that negligence, he said. Every cut I make in the present is drawn with the memory of those past failures. You accuse me of mass sacrifice. Yes, I have offered up worlds. You accuse me of terror? Yes, I have become that, because the things I hunt are not impressed by courage without teeth. Shan's hand tightened on the edge of the hololith. Caris ultima, he said. Corax's head turned, the movement very like a bird's. A necessary cut, he said. Was it? Shan asked. His voice was calm, but there was steel in it. The hives we abandoned, the guardsmen we ordered back so that the traitors could glut themselves, the night of the blackout, the 2 billion dead in a single span. Were those deaths truly necessary, or were they simply expedient? Shrike said nothing. He watched, eyes dark. Corax's gaze did not waver. If we had stood on every wall, he said softly, if we had fought for every street, if we had poured our strength into saving every last hab block, what would the end have been? He gestured, and the hololith shifted again, showing projections the Magos had constructed and not dared voice. Traitor icons surging through worlds that had been defended too long, the ritual lines complete, the sigil on the cardinal world blazing with unchallenged power. They would have died anyway, Corax said. Only then, their deaths would have fed the gods directly and left us with nothing to show for it. No broken hosts, no shattered rituals, no weakened Primarch crawling back to his pit with his sermons torn from his flesh. Tell me, my son, would you rather their lives had been wasted? The cruelty lay in how reasonable it sounded. Shan felt it, felt the weight of the argument, felt his own objections twist under it. I would rather they had lived, he said at last. Corax's eyes, if they were eyes, softened by a fraction. So would I, he said. But we are long past the days when wanting something made it possible. This is the ledger we have been given. Every line must be paid for. There are no clean balances. The chamber was very quiet. Your allegiance is not in question, the Lord Solar said finally. Your methods are. Corax let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. My allegiance is to the war, he said, to the species that still clings to life in this charnel house of a galaxy, to the sons who carry my gene seed and the memory of our legion. I will not bend knee to councils or courts. I will not don a halo and smile for statues, but I am not theirs. He pointed a talon at the hololith, now showing scattered traitor fleets limping away, broken. I am their fear, he said again, "and as long as they remember to fear, they will be slower to strike. That is all I can promise you." The council broke with nothing, resolved. Outside their chambers, the war had left more than ruins. On a shrine world spared the worst of the fighting, a lowly priest stood before his congregation and told the story of the Raven of Deliverance. He spoke of an unseen hand that smote demon worlds, of a black-winged figure that tore traitor fleets like cloth, of a Primarch who had descended from the dark to stand before his sons once more. He did not speak of sacrificed hives, of guardsmen turned into bait, of nights where shadows killed loyal as readily as heretic. Those details did not make for good sermons. In another hive, thicker with suspicion, an enforcer squad listened to whispers in the underhive of a shadow demon that wore a Primarch's face. They heard tales of a being that stepped from walls and ripped men in half for daring to think of dissent. They heard that if you spoke its name, it would arrive and cut your mouth away. Somewhere else, in a cramped cell far from any sun, a circle of robed figures knelt before a crude sigil scratched on the floor. It showed a raven with its wings spread wide. They murmured prayers not to the Emperor, not to the Four, but to something in between. A patron who killed traitors and loyalists alike. A god of justice with a knife for a tongue. Seeds were taking root. The Lord Inquisitor saw it. He activated one of his contingencies. The Grey Knights came first. They teleported into the dark with the precision of men who had practiced this art for lifetimes. Silver armor gleamed, warding runes incandescent against the night. Their halberds were sanctified. Their minds were bastions. They emerged into a cavern of shadow beneath the Ravenspire. The air was cold, not the honest cold of stone and vacuum, but the chill of things that rustled around the edges of perception. There were no lumens, no obvious doors, only the sense of a great weight overhead and a greater depth below. "Fan out," the Justicar murmured. They moved with the fluidity of a single organism, helms panning, auspex scanning for any trace of their target. He found them. He let them. The first strike landed true. A halberd that had cleaved demon princes at the shoulder bit into Corax's torso as he stepped from the wall. Runes flared. Wards screamed. The blade sank into shadow, met something harder within, and stopped. For a heartbeat, the Grey Knight who had wielded it felt triumph. Then the world inverted. His arm, from elbow to hand, was suddenly not attached to his body. He watched, with horrified clarity, as it and the weapon it held slid gently out of his perception, dropping to the floor. Blood welled from the stump in a gout that painted his armor, steaming in the cold air. Corax's hand closed around his helm. The Grey Knight's head came off with a meaty crunch, the spinal column snapping like a snapped cable. His body took 2 staggering steps before crumpling. Bolter fire roared. Blessed shells detonated where the Primarch had been an instant before. He was not there. He was between shots, between heartbeats, stepping through the thin places between light and dark. Sometimes he was a man. Sometimes he was a sliver of night. Sometimes he was just a suggestion of wings at the edge of vision. He let blows land. A nemesis hammer that carried the weight of a saint's relic smashed into his face, cracking the mask. Beneath, there was only more dark. In the same motion, he drove his talons up through the Grey Knight's groin, armor and bone and meat yielding, his claws bursting out between the warrior's shoulder blades in a spray of spinal fluid and shredded organs. One of them, grim-faced, managed to speak an invocation, summoning a gout of purifying flame that washed over Corax. For a moment, the shadows hissed. For a heartbeat, some hint of a gaunt human face seemed to swim within the blaze. Then the fire went out, and the man who had called it found his arms on the floor beside him, cut off at the elbow. He stared at the ragged ends of bone and muscle, disbelief warring with the training that had insisted this could not be happening. Corax eased a single talon into the soft flesh beneath his chin and, with a flick, removed his jaw. The Death Watch came next, summoned from the fringes of the campaign, where they had been culling Xenos opportunists in the chaos. They tracked him to an abandoned manufactorum on a half-dead world, rumors placing a shadow stalker there. They came in silent, black armor absorbing the light, kill team markings stark on their pauldrons. They found bodies, Astartes, their own, silver and black, heads missing, torsos inverted, limbs arranged in patterns that spelled out crude warnings in a language of gore. The walls were painted with their blood in long, sweeping lines that resolved, from the right perspective, into a pair of wings. They registered this in an instant. The next instant, their squad leader was missing. He reappeared at eye level with the others, dangling from invisible claws, his chest opened from throat to groin, organs spilling and hanging. His hearts were still twitching, the last few beats squeezing blood out onto the floor. Corax let the others see their shots pass through his form. Bolts screamed through him, hitting bulkheads behind. Melter blasts washed over him, slagging the machinery he had chosen to stand in front of. In return, he killed precisely. A head here, a hand there, a leg taken off at the knee to send a warrior sprawling before a final cut took off his face in a single sheet. When it was done, he crouched in the corpse-choked aisle and dipped his talons in the pooled blood. He sketched simple sigils, crude even, 2 wings, a circle, a slash, signs that would mean nothing to anyone who did not know what they stood for. He left them where they would be found. The Lord Inquisitor read the reports and understood the message. Corax came to him one final time, not in ambush, but in parley. It was aboard an exterminator's vessel, a sleek killer of worlds that lurked at the edge of the ravaged subsector, its holds filled with cyclonic torpedoes. The Lord Inquisitor had chosen it as his sanctuary, the place from which he would mete out the ultimate sanction if the Ravens strayed beyond tolerance. He had already given the order once. A world, long corrupted, had flickered with reports of a black-winged figure moving among its ruins, tearing apart remnant cults. The opportunity was too much, the temptation too great. He had authorized a cyclonic strike, reasoning that if Corax died cleansing a world, it was as good a death as any. The arming runes had lit up. The torpedoes had not launched. Instead, alarms had blared as internal sensors registered an impossible reality. The warheads were armed. Their housings were intact. Their guidance systems flickered, not to distant target coordinates, but to micro-adjustments within their own racks. The crew had barely time to swear before every torpedo in the ventral bank detonated, their destructive force contained and redirected by hands that understood the thin lines between such energies and the fabric of space. The ship survived. Barely. Whole decks were scoured. Armsmen died in droves fighting fires that had no natural fuel. The bridge shook, consoles blew. Men went blind as screens turned to flares. In the smouldering quiet that followed, as emergency systems took over, the Lord Inquisitor staggered to his feet in the chaos of his command pulpit. He found he was not alone. Corax stood at the center of the bridge amid the torn bodies of armsmen who had drawn weapons and died for the attempt. Their limbs lay in neat piles. Their heads stared from a line along the wall, eyes wide. "You would erase my hunting grounds," the Primarch said. His tone was calm. "You would burn worlds I am not yet finished with, out of fear that the thing killing your enemies does not obey your every whim." The Inquisitor's mouth was dry. "You are a threat," he managed, "to more than the traitors, to all we are supposed to protect." Corax inclined his head. "And so you tried to kill me by killing a few billion more," he said. "I see we share an understanding of proportionality." He stepped close to the main viewing port, outside the slowly healing wound where the Cardinal world had been still festered. Corax reached out, placed a hand on the plasteel. The material frosted around his fingers. "This is how it will be," he said without turning. "I will not claim thrones. I will not demand tribute. I will not ask for fleets or worlds or the obedience of your lords. I will hunt in the dark places where your laws do not reach and your dogmas cannot function. I will break those who once called themselves my brothers and the lesser creatures that cluster around them. I will do the work you write about in your prayers and refuse to commit to in reality." He turned then, eyes like pits. "In return, you will stop trying to leash me," he said. "You will not send assassins. You will not aim your planet killers at my shadow, because it offends your sensibilities. You will accept that some monsters cannot be caged without the bars doing more harm than the beast." "And if we refuse?" the Inquisitor asked. "Then I will show you," Corax said simply, "what I can do to loyal worlds as easily as I did to that cardinal abomination. I will balance your ledger as readily as theirs. I am not picky in whose blood settles old accounts." The threat hung in the air between them, cold and heavy. Corax left without walking. One moment he was there. The next, the shadows had folded around him, swallowing his form, leaving only the corpses and the stink of opened bowels behind. The Inquisitor did not countermand exterminatus orders after that. He simply did not give them where the ravens flew. In the Ravenspire, under a sky that was slowly remembering what stars looked like without eclipses, Corax spoke with his sons one last time. The chamber was smaller than the Strategium, less grand than the Gene Vaults. It was a place of practice once, a hall where aspirants had been taught the basics of stealth and killing. Now it was empty, save for 3 men. Shan stood with his hands clasped behind him, staring at the practice dummies that had been carved into rough likenesses of Astartes legends. Shrike leaned against a pillar, helmless, the pale beak of his helm hanging from one hand. Corax sat upon an old training block, wings half furled, the lines of his form wavering. "When I taught the 19th, I gave them 3 paths," he said. "Ambush, infiltration, terror, the trifold path of shadow. You have read the catechisms. You have lived them." "We have," Shrike said. "The war has changed," Corax went on. "The galaxy has rotted further. Your enemies are not only flesh and steel, but ideas and diseases of the mind. The old path is no longer enough." He raised a hand, tracing 3 lines in the air. "Ambush remains," he said, "the strike from unexpected quarters, the attack that turns the enemy's strength against him. But now, it must be applied not just to bodies, but to plans, to rituals, to the very paths by which your foes move their will." A second line. "Infiltration remains," he continued, "not just of walls and fortresses, but of stories, of belief, of the tales men tell of what it means to fight under the Raven. You must learn to be ghosts in more than stone." A third. "And terror," he said. "Most of all, terror. But you must understand it in ways I did not once. Fear is a weapon, yes, but it is also a stain. Use it too freely, and you will become what you fear. Use it too reluctantly, and you will die to those who do not hesitate." He looked at them both. "If you follow me too closely, you will become like me," he said. The admission was quiet. It was the first hint of doubt either of them had heard in his voice. "A thing that kills in the dark until the killing is all that remains," he said. "You will lose the line between who deserves to die and who happens to be standing in the wrong shadow. The warp will offer you power to make your cuts deeper. It will whisper that each compromise is necessary. I have listened to those whispers for a very long time." "And if we reject you entirely?" Shan asked. "Then you may not survive what comes," Corax said. "Your enemies do not hesitate. They do not balk at slaughter. They will tear you apart if you go to them with only pretty notions of honor and restraint." He spread his hands, talons glinting. "You must walk between," he said, "as we were always meant to, the line between duty and monstrosity, between justice and vengeance, Do not expect applause. Do not expect thanks. Only the knowledge that someone had to stand where you stand, and that for a time it was you. Silence settled. Shan nodded slowly. "We will try," he said. Shrike's eyes were shadowed. "We already are," he added. Corax rose. He walked with them to the edge of the Ravenspire. The view from the observation platform looked out over Deliverance's tortured surface. The scars of the campaign were visible even here. New fortifications gouged into the rock, cratered impact sites, the glitter of wreckage still being pulled from the void. The sky was clear for the first time in what felt like centuries. "You will be watched," Corax said, standing with his wings half spread, "by the Inquisition, by the Lords of Terror, by men who fear what I represent and will see my stain on you, whether it is there or not. Do not give them easy reasons to be right." Shan glanced at him. "And you?" he asked. "Where will you go?" Corax smiled without humor. "Where the traitors run," he said. "They have seen what waits for them in their shrines. They will seek new holes, new worlds to twist. Someone must be there when they arrive." He stepped backward. The air behind him tore. Black wings unfolded from nothing, each feather an absence, each plume a slice in the world. They spread behind him in an arc that dwarfed the platform, blotting out the view. Shan opened his mouth to speak. Shrike only bowed his head. Across the sector, astropaths who had begun to sleep again jerked awake. Eyes rolled back. Mouths opened. A single word thundered through their skulls. Not loud, but inescapable. Nevermore. It was different than it had been on the demon world. There, it had been a curse. A promise whispered through gritted teeth. Here, it carried a colder certainty. Nevermore shall they know peace. The meaning was layered. For the traitors, it was a sentence. There would be no sanctuary, no forgotten corner of the warp where they could rebuild unmolested. The Raven would come, even again and again, until their last sermons were written in their own blood. For the Imperium, it was a reassurance and a threat in one. An unseen hand would continue to cut its enemies where they slept, but it would cut unbound. It would not be leashed by law or litany. If it turned, if the fine line it walked finally gave way, there would be no wall high enough to stop it. On the platform, the wings folded inward, taking Corax with them. The tear in the air healed, leaving only the ordinary night beyond, pricked with indifferent stars. The galaxy spun on. Wars burned in 100 other places. New cults rose. Old empires cracked. Men lived and worked and died in ignorance of the ledger being kept in the shadows of their worlds. Somewhere in that dark, a murder of ravens wheeled, looking for the next line to write.